Hello everyone, I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first thing I noticed wasn't the broken lock or the scattered papers, it was the silence. Marcus's apartment had always been filled with sound vinyl records, crackling multiple computers, humming his constant typing. Now there was only the soft hiss of the refrigerator and my own breathing too loud in my ears. Something was wrong. The air felt charged like the moment before lightning strikes. I stood in the doorway, camera bag slung over my shoulder. Marcus had been missing for 3 days. No calls, no texts, nothing on social media. It wasn't like him to disappear, especially with our upcoming gallery exhibition. When he didn't show up for our final planning meeting, I decided to check his place. The splintered doorframe told me someone else had the same idea. The apartment was a disaster of overturned furniture and empty drawers, but there was something methodical about the chaos, as if the intruders had been searching for something specific. I moved through the living room toward Marcus's home studio, stepping over smashed picture frames and torn photography books. My skin prickled despite the disarray. Certain items, expensive electronics. Marcus's prized camera collection remained untouched. The studio door was ajar, a sliver of blue light spilling into the hallway. Marcus had been working on something new, something he wouldn't discuss over the phone. All he'd said was that it would change everything about how we see the world. I'd assumed it was pretentious photographer talk. Now I wasn't so sure I pushed the door open. Unlike the rest of the apartment, the studio was immaculate. Marcus's main workstation hummed quietly. Multiple monitors displaying what looked like code. Against the far wall stood a table with equipment I'd never seen before. Modified cameras, strange prismatic lenses, and devices that resembled medical instruments more than photography gear. The centerpiece was a bulky headset connected to one of the cameras with dark lenses where eyepieces should be. Something about it seemed wrong, the angles too sharp, the materials too organic. I felt a compulsion to look away, but my curiosity was stronger. A notebook lay open beside the apparatus, filled with Marcus's cramped handwriting and diagrams I couldn't make sense of. Words jumped out at me. Frequency adjustment, perceptual overlay, astral detection. The final entry, dated 3 days ago, read, "Final calibration complete. They're everywhere. God help us all." My pulse quickened. I picked up the headset, turning it over in my hands. It was surprisingly light, warm to the touch. The lenses weren't glass or plastic, but some crystalline material that seemed to shift colors as I moved it. Iridescent like oil on water, I shouldn't have put it on. Every horror movie rule screamed against it, but I did anyway, driven by concern for my friend and an irrational certainty that this was connected to his disappearance. The world went black when I secured the headset, and for a moment panic surged through me. Then shapes emerged from the darkness, outlines of the room glowing in faint blue. I felt a pressure building behind my eyes, a sensation like fingers pressing against my optic nerves. The pain was sudden and excruciating, a white-hot needle piercing through my skull. I tore the headset off, stumbling backward. My vision blurry and distorted. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my sight, but the strange overlay remained. Translucent shapes hovering at the edges of normal reality. I rubbed my eyes hard enough to see stars, but when I opened them again, the effect had intensified. The room now had 2 aspects: the physical space I knew and another dimension superimposed over it. Trails of luminous energy clung to objects, pulsed through electrical wires, swirled in eddies around certain items. Marcus's equipment glowed with a sickly green aura, tendrils reaching out like living things. I backed away, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't happening. I was hallucinating, having some kind of breakdown, but the rational explanations evaporated when I looked at my hands. Around them swirled a soft golden light that followed my movements, leaving traces in the air like sparklers on a long exposure photograph. A sound from the front room snapped me back to awareness. The apartment door opening. Footsteps approached. Too quiet, too measured. Without thinking, I ducked into the supply closet, pulling the door nearly shut. Through the crack, I saw 3 figures enter the studio. They looked human, ordinary. A woman in a business suit, a middle-aged man in jeans and a flannel shirt, and a younger man wearing a delivery uniform. But overlaid on their human forms were other shapes. The woman's silhouette was surrounded by a chitinous exoskeleton, multiple limbs folding and unfolding in impossible geometries. The middle-aged man's astral body was vast and amorphous, a gelatinous mass with countless eyes that blinked independently. The delivery man's true form was the most disturbing, a hollow shell with something serpentine writhing inside, occasionally extending tendrils through orifices that shouldn't exist. My heart hammered so hard I was certain they would hear it. Sweat trickled down my spine as I pressed myself against the shelves, knocking something that clattered to the floor. The 3 figures turned in unison toward the closet. The woman spoke, her voice perfectly normal, horribly incongruous with her true form. She asked if someone was there. I remained frozen, not daring to breathe. She turned to her companion, suggesting that perhaps it was just the building settling, but her astral appendages reached toward the closet, feeling the air like antenna. The middle-aged man moved to Marcus's equipment, examining the headset I'd dropped. He told the others that someone had used it recently, that they could sense the activation. The delivery man began methodically searching the room, moving closer to my hiding spot with each step. I closed my eyes as if that could make me invisible. When I opened them, the delivery man was staring directly at the closet door. Our eyes met through the crack, and I saw recognition flicker across his human face. Beneath it, the serpentine entity coiled tightly, preparing to strike. I burst from the closet, shoving past him with desperate strength. The woman's chitinous limbs reached for me, but I ducked under them. Feeling something sharp graze my shoulder, I ran through the apartment, knocking over anything I could to slow their pursuit. Behind me, they didn't shout or curse. They moved with terrible, silent efficiency. I made it to the hallway, sprinting toward the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator. My vision continued to shift between normal reality and the astral overlay. Making it difficult to judge distances, I stumbled several times, my lungs burning, adrenaline surging through my system in waves that made my extremities tingle and my temples throb. Outside, the world had transformed completely. Every person I passed had 2 aspects. Most were normal humans surrounded by warm-colored auras that fluctuated with their emotions. But others were like the 3 in Marcus's apartment. Entities wearing human forms like ill-fitting suits, their true nature visible only to my altered eyes. I weaved through the evening crowd, constantly looking over my shoulder. They were following, not running, but moving with purposeful determination, communicating with subtle gestures. Worse, I noticed others joining them, alerted by some silent signal. A businessman checking his phone, a woman walking her dog, a street vendor closing his stall. All of them turned to track my movement, their astral forms writhing with predatory intent. I ducked into a subway station, buying time rather than escape. My phone had no signal underground, but I tried calling Marcus anyway, leaving a frantic voicemail about what I'd seen. How many of them were there? How long had they been among us? What did they want in the grimy bathroom mirror? I examined my eyes. They looked normal at first glance, but when I leaned closer, I could see something in the pupils. Tiny fractal patterns that shifted and realigned like living circuits. Whatever the headset had done to me was still happening. Still changing me. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to think. The subway car was half empty when I boarded. An elderly woman sitting across from me smiled kindly. Her aura was a gentle blue, reassuringly human. I almost smiled back before I noticed her reflection in the window, or rather the lack of it. Where her reflection should have been was only an empty seat. My breath caught in my throat. She continued smiling as her human disguise began to slip, revealing glimpses of something ancient and patient beneath. I changed cars at the next stop, moving to a more crowded section, seeking safety in numbers. But how could there be safety when I couldn't tell who was human and who wasn't? I spent the night moving, never staying in one place too long. My eyes burned and throbbed, tears of pain occasionally streaming down my face. The astral overlay became more distinct with each passing hour. I could now see connections between the entities. Filaments of dark energy passing information, coordinating their hunt. By dawn, I'd made it to my apartment, but I didn't dare go inside. Instead, I watched from across the street as two figures, a police officer and a utility worker, stood near my building entrance. Their astral forms were massive, spilling out of their human shells, tendrils reaching up toward my window. They knew where I lived. I retreated to a 24-hour diner ordering coffee. I couldn't drink, my stomach too knotted with fear. The waitress was human. Her aura a tired orange-yellow. I asked her if the TV could be turned to the news, needing to know if there was any report about Marcus. She obliged, but there was nothing. No missing person report, no mention of a break-in at his apartment. It was as if he'd been erased. My phone vibrated with a text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk about what you've seen. I can help Central Park. Bethesda Fountain Noon." It was signed simply M. Marcus. It seemed too convenient, too obvious a trap. But I had nowhere else to turn, no one else who might understand what was happening to me. I spent the morning circling the park, watching for followers, jumping at every shadow. My eyes continued to worsen the pain, now constant vision blurring at the edges where reality met the astral plane. I arrived at the fountain early, scanning faces in the crowd, trying to distinguish human from other. There were more of them than I'd realized. Perhaps 1 in every 8 people concealed something else beneath their human appearance. They moved through the world perfectly camouflaged, interacting seamlessly with unsuspecting humans. A man sat down beside me on the fountain's edge. It took me a moment to recognize Marcus. He'd lost weight, his face, gaunt eyes sunken, but his aura was human, fractured and disturbed, but human. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He asked quietly how long I'd been able to see. When I told him it had been less than 24 hours, he nodded, explaining that the changes would continue, that the pain would eventually subside as my brain adapted to processing dual realities. Simultaneously, I had so many questions, but he raised a hand to stop me. There wasn't much time. They were hunting him too. Had been for days. The equipment in his apartment was the culmination of years of research into what he called perceptual frequencies. He'd created the device by accident, intending only to develop a camera that could capture a wider spectrum of light. What he'd found instead was that reality had layers, and that humanity shared the world with entities that existed just beyond normal perception. They'd been here all along, living among us, wearing human identities. Some were born looking human but were never human inside. Others took over existing people, hollowing them out and wearing them like disguises. I asked what they wanted. Marcus didn't know for certain, but he believed they were parasitic in nature, feeding on something humans produced. Emotions, life energy, or something we didn't even have a name for yet. What he did know was that they were organized, ancient, and determined to remain hidden. He'd created several versions of the headset hidden backups in case anything happened to him. That's why they hadn't killed him yet. They needed to know where all the devices were. He'd been on the run, moving constantly to avoid capture. Now that I'd used one of the devices, I was marked too. A family walked past the parents. Human, their teenage son not. The boy's head turned to track us, too deliberate, too focused. Marcus tensed beside me. They'd found us. He pressed something into my hand, a small flash drive. Everything he'd learned was there, he told me, along with a program that could help identify the entities through digital photography. There were others who knew a loose network of people with the site. The drive contained contact information, safe locations. We couldn't stay together, it would make us easier to track. We needed to separate to find others who could see, to figure out what these entities were planning. Marcus's research had suggested something was building some kind of coordination among the entities that hadn't been present before. As he spoke, I noticed more of them converging on the area, a jogger stopping to retie shoes that weren't loose, a hot dog vendor abandoning his cart, a tourist who kept taking photos in our direction. Their astral forms were agitated, pulsing with colors I couldn't name. We parted quickly, moving in opposite directions. I slipped the flash drive into my sock, trying to appear casual as I walked toward the nearest exit. My altered vision continued to shift and adjust, the astral plane becoming clearer, while physical reality occasionally blurred. The entities were everywhere, communicating through pulses of energy that created patterns in the air. I felt their attention like a physical weight pressing against my skin. They knew what I could see. They knew I had become a witness to their secret existence, and they wouldn't stop until they found me, but I wouldn't make it easy for them. I had evidence now. I had knowledge. And somewhere out there were others like me and Marcus, people who could see beyond the veil, who knew the truth about the things living among us wearing human faces. As I left the park, I glanced back one last time. A group had formed around the fountain where Marcus and I had sat, their human shapes arranged in casual postures, while their astral bodies performed some complex ritual over the space we'd occupied. They were tracking us, scenting us like bloodhounds. I turned away and kept walking, one hand clutching the flash drive through my pocket. The sun passed behind a cloud, casting the city in shadow. My vision flickered between worlds as a new certainty settled in my bones. Nothing would ever look the same again. Story 2. The first time I saw him, I thought it was just the alcohol playing tricks on my mind. A tall, thin silhouette standing in the corner of my bedroom. Its proportions all wrong, limbs too long, head slightly askew. When I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. Just shadows cast by the streetlight filtering through my blinds, but from the corner of my eye I could see it shifting, watching, waiting. That was 3 days ago. Now I know it never leaves. My head pounded with the familiar rhythm of a hangover as sunlight pierced through my eyelids. Last night had been a blur, a work promotion that led to too many shots at O'Malley's, a cab ride home that I barely remembered, and then something else, something that clung to the edges of my memory like cobwebs. I forced myself to sit up, my mouth bone dry and tasting of stale whiskey. The digital clock on my nightstand read 11:37 a.m. I had slept through most of the morning, which wasn't surprising given how much I'd drunk. What was surprising was the glass of water sitting next to the clock. I never remembered to leave water for myself when I stumbled home drunk. But there it was, a full glass of water that I had no memory of pouring. I reached for it, my hand trembling slightly. The cool liquid soothed my parched throat. But as I drank, an unsettling feeling crept up my spine. Something else was different. My bedroom door, which I always closed at night out of habit, stood wide open. Maybe I'd just forgotten to close it. Maybe I'd gotten up in the middle of the night to get the water and left it open. But as I set the empty glass down, I noticed something on the floor. A faint luminous smear, like someone had dragged a glow stick across the hardwood. It trailed from the foot of my bed toward the door, disappearing into the hallway. I blinked several times, convinced it was an optical illusion caused by my hangover. But the ghostly trail remained, casting a sickly greenish glow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. As I watched, transfixed, the luminescence began to fade, growing dimmer until it vanished completely, leaving no trace it had ever been there. My heart rate quickened as I scanned the room. Everything else seemed normal. Clothes draped over the chair, laptop closed on the desk, phone charging on the nightstand. I reached for the phone, needing the comfort of its familiar weight in my hand, but it wasn't there. The charger cable lay on the nightstand, its end empty and accusatory. I distinctly remembered plugging in my phone before going out last night. It was a ritual, wallet keys. Phone charged always. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the apartment. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of blood in my ears. My apartment was old, built in the 1930s, and had all the quirks that came with age. Settling noises were common, but this wasn't the usual groan of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. This was the distinct sound of weight shifting on the floor. Someone or something was in my apartment. The rational part of my brain suggested it might be an intruder, some opportunist who had followed my drunken self home. But rational thoughts were immediately drowned out by the memory of what I thought I'd seen last night. A figure standing in the corner. A figure that disappeared when I looked directly at it. I slid out of bed, wincing as my feet touched the cold floor where the luminous trail had been. No residue, no stickiness, no evidence. Anything had been there at all. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed, a remnant from college days that now served as my only weapon, and moved cautiously toward the door. The hallway was empty, shadows pooling in the corners where sunlight couldn't reach. My apartment wasn't large. A bedroom, bathroom, living room, and kitchen, all connected by this single hallway, nowhere for someone to hide. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The living room came next. Everything seemed in order at first glance. Couch, coffee table, TV, bookshelf. But then I noticed the photo frames on the shelf. All of them, every single one, was facing the wall. The backs of the frames stared at me like blank faces hiding the photos I knew were inside. Pictures of family friends my life captured in frozen moments. My mouth went dry again, but this time it wasn't from the hangover. I approached the shelf slowly, bat raised in one hand, and turned one of the frames around. It was a photo of my parents and me from last Christmas. Their smiling faces looked back at me, oblivious to the wrongness permeating my apartment. I turned another frame and another until all were facing the right way again. As I set the last one down, I noticed something on the coffee table that made my stomach lurch. My phone, which should have been charging in the bedroom, lay in the center of the table, its black screen reflecting the ceiling. Next to it was a half-empty glass of whiskey that I definitely hadn't poured. I picked up the phone with shaking hands. 3 missed calls from work. It was Monday and I was supposed to be at the office 2 hours ago, but that wasn't what sent ice water through my veins. It was the most recent app used on my phone. The camera, I tapped on it and the gallery opened to reveal dozens of new photos taken throughout the night. Photos of my empty apartment, photos of my living room, kitchen, hallway, photos of me sleeping taken from the corner of my bedroom where I thought I'd seen the figure standing. The bat clattered to the floor as I scrolled through image after image, each one more disturbing than the last. In some strange artifacts appeared lens, flares or light leaks that created elongated shadows stretching across the walls. In others, that same luminous substance formed patterns on the floor, swirls and symbols that meant nothing to me but seemed deliberate, purposeful. And then I came to the last photo. It showed my living room, the very room I was standing in. Now taken from the perspective of someone sitting on my couch. The room was empty except for a strange distortion in the air, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. Within that distortion, I could almost make out a face not human, with features that seemed to shift and flow even in the static image. The timestamp on the photo read less than 8 hours ago. My heart hammered against my ribs as I backed away from the coffee table. That's when I noticed the security camera in the corner of the ceiling, the one I'd installed after a break-in at the apartment next door last year. It blinked its red eye at me as silent witness to whatever had happened in the night. I stumbled to my desk where my laptop sat and opened it with fumbling fingers. The security app connected to the camera immediately, and I navigated to last night's footage. There I was arriving home at 1:43 a.m., visibly intoxicated, struggling with my keys before finally getting the door open. I watched as I staggered inside, threw my jacket over the couch, and made my way to the bedroom. Nothing unusual, yet I fast-forwarded through an hour of empty living room footage until motion triggered the recording again at 2:52 a.m. It was me returning to the living room in my t-shirt and boxers. But something was off about my movements, more fluid than they should have been given my inebriated state. I watched as I sat down on the couch and appeared to start talking, gesturing animatedly at the empty space beside me. There was no audio on the footage, but I could see myself laughing, nodding, even raising an imaginary toast to the air. After a few minutes, I got up and went to the kitchen, returning with the glass of whiskey and setting it on the coffee table. Then I sat back down and continued my one-sided conversation. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead as I watched. I had no memory of any of this. None. In the footage, I suddenly looked up as if startled by something and stared directly at the camera. My expression changed from jovial to concerned, then to something that looked like fear. I stood up, moved closer to the camera, and reached up toward it. The footage cut out. When it resumed a minute later, I was no longer in the frame. The living room was empty again, except for a faint trail of luminous material that hadn't been there before. It formed a path from the couch to the hallway, identical to what I'd seen in my bedroom this morning. I slammed the laptop shut, unable to watch anymore. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my breath came in short, painful gasps. I needed to get out of the apartment to clear my head, to convince myself that all of this had a logical explanation. I'd been drunk, possibly even hallucinating. Maybe someone had slipped something into my drink at the bar that would explain the memory gaps, the strange behavior on camera, but it didn't explain the luminous trails or the moved phone or the backwards picture frames. I dressed quickly, not bothering to shower, and gathered my wallet and keys. As I reached for my phone on the coffee table, something caught my eye. Movement reflected in the black screen. I whirled around, expecting to see someone behind me, but the living room was empty. When I turned back, my phone was gone. It had been there just seconds ago, and now it was gone. My breath hitched in my throat as panic began to set in. I dropped to my knees, looking under the coffee table, then the couch, then every piece of furniture in the room. Nothing. A soft thud came from the kitchen. I rose slowly, every muscle tense. The kitchen doorway gaped like an open mouth, shadows pooling inside. Despite the late morning sun streaming through the windows, I moved toward it, telling myself it was just something falling, maybe a dish settling in the drying rack. My phone lay in the middle of the kitchen floor, its screen now illuminated open to the text messaging app. A new message had been typed but not sent. "Do you see me now?" The word swam before my eyes as the room seemed to tilt. I braced myself against the doorframe, fighting the urge to vomit. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a tall, thin shape standing by the refrigerator. When I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there, but I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that something was watching me. Something that could move my possessions, use my phone, talk to me while I was drunk and vulnerable. Something that could pass through walls. I backed out of the kitchen, unable to tear my gaze away from the spot where I'd glimpsed the figure. As I retreated, the lights in the kitchen flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging that section of the apartment into darkness. Despite the daylight outside, I ran out of the apartment, down the 3 flights of stairs, into the street where normal people were going about their normal Monday lives. The sun warmed my face, but did nothing to dispel the cold horror that had taken root inside me. I walked aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of what was happening. By the time evening fell, I had convinced myself that I was having some kind of breakdown. The stress of work, too much alcohol, not enough sleep. It was all catching up to me in the form of paranoid delusions. I needed rest, proper food, maybe even to talk to someone professional. But first I needed to go home and face my empty apartment. The building was quiet as I climbed the stairs. Most residents still at work or out for the evening. I paused outside, my door key in hand, listening for any sound from within. Nothing, just the normal creaks and groans of an old building. I entered cautiously, flipping on every light switch as I moved through the rooms. Everything looked normal. The photo frames were still facing the right way. My phone was where I'd left it, on the kitchen floor. The security camera blinked it. Steady red eye. Relief washed over me as I sank onto the couch. It had been my imagination, after all. Fueled by a wicked hangover and possibly some kind of sleep disturbance. I'd make an appointment with my doctor tomorrow, maybe take a few days off work to recover properly. As I leaned back, something crinkled under the cushion. I reached beneath me and pulled out a piece of paper that hadn't been there before. It was a printout from my own printer, showing a single image, The last photo from my phone, the one with the strange distortion in the air. But this version was different. Something had circled the distortion in red ink and written beneath it in jagged, uneven letters. I've always been here. My blood ran cold as I stared at the words. That's when I felt it. A presence behind me looming over the couch. I could see it in my peripheral vision. Impossibly tall, impossibly thin. Its limbs at angles that no human body could achieve. I wanted to turn to confront it, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like drowning. The lights flickered throughout the apartment, and in the momentary darkness, I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck. Not a hand, but something that left that same luminous residue. I'd seen before. I could feel it on my skin. A wet, sticky sensation that burned slightly. When the light stabilized, I found myself able to move again. I leapt from the couch, whirling around to find nothing, just the empty apartment. But the sensation on my neck remained. I rushed to the bathroom and turned my back to the mirror, craning my neck to see. There it was, a glowing handprint too large and with too many fingers to be human spread across my neck and upper back. As I watched in horror, the luminescence began to fade just as it had on the floor that morning. But something else was happening now. The mirror was fogging up. Despite there being no hot water running, condensation spread across its surface in uneven patches until the entire mirror was obscured. Then slowly letters began to appear in the fog as if traced by an invisible finger. You invited me in. I stumbled backward, colliding with the shower curtain and nearly falling into the tub. The bathroom door slammed shut on its own and the lock turned with a decisive click. The lights flickered again, more violently this time, and in the strobe-like effect I could see it standing in the corner, a figure composed not of flesh but of shadow and light. Its form constantly shifting and flowing like smoke underwater. It was between me and the door. There was nowhere to run. I pressed myself against the far wall, feeling the cold tile against my back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The thing moved closer, not walking but gliding, leaving those luminous trails with each movement. In the pulsing light, I could make out more details, limbs that bent at too many joints, a head that seemed to change shape with each flicker, and where its face should have been only darkness, punctuated by points of light like distant stars. My mind reeled as fragments of memory from the night before began to resurface, coming home drunk, sensing a presence in the darkened apartment, speaking to it, inviting it to sit with me, to drink with me. In my intoxicated state, I had thought it fascinating, not frightening, an impossible visitor that could move through walls and bend reality. I had invited it in, and now it wouldn't leave. The bathroom lights gave one final violent flicker before going out completely. In the darkness, I felt it draw closer, its presence overwhelming in the small space. The air grew thick and cold, making it difficult to breathe. I could smell something accurate and alien like ozone mixed with copper. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end, that whatever this entity was, it had come to claim me. But instead of pain or oblivion, I felt something press into my hand, something small and hard and familiar. My phone. When the lights suddenly came back on, I was alone in the bathroom. The door was unlocked and slightly ajar. The mirror was clear, with no trace of the message that had been there moments before. I looked down at the phone in my hand, its screen illuminated to show the security camera app. With trembling fingers, I pressed play on the most recent footage. There I was entering the apartment just minutes ago, walking through the room, sitting on the couch, finding something under the cushion, but it wasn't a piece of paper. There was nothing there at all. I watched as I stared at my empty hand, then suddenly leapt up and ran to the bathroom. The footage showed me standing in front of the mirror, touching the back of my neck where there was nothing to see. Talking to empty air, backing up against the wall as if cornered by some invisible threat. The camera hadn't captured anything unusual. No flickering lights, no entity, no luminous trails. Just me alone acting out a terrifying encounter with something that wasn't there. I sank to the bathroom floor, the cold tiles grounding me in reality. Had I imagined it all, was I losing my mind as if an answer? The phone in my hand vibrated with an incoming text message, unknown number. I opened it with numb fingers to find 3 words that made my heart stop. See you tonight. I stared at the screen until it went dark, reflecting my pale face back at me. And in that reflection, just over my shoulder, I could see it watching me from the corner of the room. A distortion in the air that disappeared when I spun around. I know now that it never leaves. It's always here, just at the edge of vision. Waiting for night to fall, waiting for me to let my guard down again. I've stopped drinking, stopped sleeping, installed more cameras, more lights. But none of it matters, because how do you escape something that can move through walls? How do you fight something that exists in the corner of your eye? How do you flee from something that's taken up residence not just in your home, but in the darkest corners of your mind? And worst of all, how can you be sure it wasn't there all along, waiting for you to finally notice it? Story 3. The first time I felt it was on an ordinary Tuesday in September. A subtle vibration beneath my feet as I crossed the polished marble floor of Blackwood University's central library. So faint that I initially dismissed it as a passing truck on the nearby road, or perhaps some distant construction work. But when I placed my palm against the cool stone pillar beside the reference desk, there it was again. A gentle, persistent tremor, like the building itself was breathing. That same night, the dreams began. Not nightmares, not yet. Just fragments of unfamiliar corridors, lined with shelves that seemed to stretch into impossible distances, and the constant sensation of something vast, stirring in the darkness below. My name is Dr. Thomas Harlow, professor of archaeology at Blackwood, and what I've witnessed over the past 3 months has fundamentally altered my understanding of reality. I write this account not knowing if it will ever be read, or if my mind will remain intact long enough to complete it. But the record must exist, even if only as a warning. The investigation began innocently enough. I'd noticed unusual patterns in student behavior, small groups gathering in the libraries, forgotten corners at odd hours, exchanging furtive glances in hallways and abruptly ending conversations. When faculty approached academic politics being what they are, I initially suspected some trivial undergraduate rebellion or cheating scheme. Looking back, I wish it had been something so mundane. I first infiltrated what I later learned was called the Circle of the Unbound Eye by following a particularly suspicious graduate student named Ellis after a late seminar. The autumn air bit at my skin as I maintained a discreet distance while he wound through campus, eventually disappearing into the east wing of the library, a section officially closed for renovations since last spring. My curiosity overrode caution as I slipped in through the same service entrance he had used. The cold hit me first, a penetrating chill that seemed to bypass my coat and settle directly into my bones. Then came the silence, different from the usual library quiet. This was a smothering absence of sound that made my footsteps seem obscenely loud no matter how carefully I placed each foot. Navigating through dust-covered stacks, I followed the faint glow of light coming from what had once been the ancient texts repository. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crouched behind a collapsed bookshelf. Through the gap between fallen volumes, I observed a scene that defied rational explanation. 7 students and 1 faculty member, Dr. Elias Vernern from the physics department, stood in a precise circular formation around a section of exposed flooring. The marble tiles had been removed, revealing not concrete foundation but a pit of churning darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. Ellis and the others chanted in a language I couldn't identify, the syllables harsh and guttural, yet flowing with a perverse rhythm that made my stomach clench as I watched the darkness in the pit begin to fold. That's the only word that approximates what I saw. It creased and pleated like fabric, revealing glimpses of something beyond, flashes of impossible geometries and colors that had no place in our visible spectrum. My mouth went dry and cold. Sweat soaked through my shirt as I witnessed Dr. Werner retrieve an object from an ornate box, a small obsidian disc inscribed with spiraling symbols. When he held it over the pit, it began to rotate without being touched slowly, at first then faster until it became a blur. I must have made some sound because Vera suddenly turned in my direction. Our eyes met through the gap, and in that instant, a connection formed that transcended normal human interaction. His pupils dilated until they nearly consumed the iris, and I felt a pressure inside my skull as if something foreign had slipped into my mind and was feeling its way around. I fled, my legs carrying me as fast as they could through the maze of shelves, my lungs burning as I burst through the exit and ran until the library was far behind me. That night I dreamed of Vera and the others not as an observer but as a participant. We stood together around the pit, our voices joined in that same repellent chant. In the dream, I understood every word an invocation to something ancient, buried beneath the university grounds, something that had slept for millennia but was now stirring in response to our call. I felt its consciousness brush against mine, vast and cold and unutterably alien. When I awoke, my throat was raw and my lips formed words I did not know. Over the following weeks, I conducted my investigation with methodical precision, dividing my time between official university duties and increasingly bold surveillance of the circle. I accessed restricted historical records that revealed Blackwood had been built upon the ruins of an older structure, not a European settlement as commonly believed, but something far older that predated colonial history. References in the original university charter mentioned a guardian obligation and the sealed repository, but details were frustratingly vague. My breakthrough came when I discovered a forgotten subbase entrance hidden behind an environmental systems panel in the anthropology building. The narrow stone staircase descended far deeper than any modern foundation should have gone, the air growing increasingly stale and cold as I ventured down with only my flashlight illuminating the way. Each step sent shivers of anticipation up my spine, my ears straining for any sound beyond my own careful movements. At the bottom, I found evidence of recent excavation, modern tools alongside centuries-old artifacts. The circle had been busy. Display cases contained objects that defied classification, metallic components with no discernible purpose, crystalline structures that seemed to shift configuration when not directly observed, and tablets inscribed with the same spiraling symbols from Vera's obsidian disk. I made the critical mistake of touching one of these artifacts, a small pyramid-shaped object that appeared to be made of copper, but felt wrong against my skin, too light, and somehow slippery as if partially phased out of our reality. As my fingers closed around it, a jolt of electricity shot up my arm and the room around me momentarily dissolved. For a fraction of a second, I perceived the true nature of the chamber. Not an archaeological storage room, but a node in a vast network that extended through dimensions beyond human comprehension. The pyramid burned cold in my palm, and I couldn't release it until the vision passed, leaving me gasping and disoriented, the taste of metal flooding my mouth. I pocketed the artifact without fully understanding why. That night, I examined it in my campus apartment, placing it on my desk where it occasionally emitted a faint humming noise that made my teeth ache. Sleep, when it finally came, thrust me once more into the shared dreamscape with the circle members. This time, they noticed me. Ellis approached in the dream, his movements too fluid to be natural, his smile stretching inhumanly wide as he welcomed me to the awakening. Vera stood behind him, nodding approvingly, explaining that they had sensed my connection from the beginning. The pyramid had merely accelerated the inevitable. I woke to find my notebook filled with drawings. I had no memory of creating intricate diagrams of the library's foundation and what appeared to be a massive chamber beneath it, along with calculations and equations far beyond my mathematical expertise. My hands trembled as I flipped through page after page of this impossible work. The most disturbing element was not the content, but the handwriting, unmistakably mine, yet executed with a precision I could never achieve while conscious. In the days that followed, my perception began to fragment. Reality seemed increasingly thin, transparent in places. Walking across campus, I would catch glimpses of something else superimposed over the familiar buildings. A different architecture, ancient and non-Euclidean, that seemed to exist simultaneously with our own students. Passing by occasionally flickered their faces, momentarily replaced by writhing patterns of light that left after images burned into my vision. The pyramid grew warmer each day, eventually requiring me to store it in my freezer to stop the constant humming. Even there, it affected the surrounding space, food items in proximity to it, spoiled in strange ways, developing colors and textures that nothing organic should possess. My dreams became more vivid, more directive. The entity beneath the library was communicating through us using the circle as conduits, but reaching out to others with compatible neurological patterns. It was lonely having slumbered alone for ages beyond counting. It was hungry for connection. It was waking up. I realized I needed to witness a full ritual to understand what I was facing. Using information gleaned from my dreams and notebook scribblings, I determined the next gathering would occur during the new moon. 3 days hence, I prepared meticulously, fortifying myself with stimulants to avoid falling into trance and bringing recording equipment to document whatever transpired. The night arrived cold and moonless. The campus unusually quiet as I made my way to the library. My heart pounded so loudly I feared it would give me away, and my mouth felt like parchment as I slipped once more into the east wing. This time I knew exactly where to go and how to avoid detection. The circle had expanded. 15 members now, including 2 more faculty and several individuals I didn't recognize as university affiliates. They had cleared a larger area around the pit, which had grown significantly wider since my first observation. From my hiding place behind a support column, I watched as they arranged artifacts similar to my pyramid, in a precise geometric pattern around the pit's circumference. Each object began to vibrate and emit a pale light that bent unnaturally around corners. Verer led the proceedings, his voice stronger and more confident than in previous rituals, his body moving with that same unsettling fluidity I had observed in Ellis during our shared dream. The chanting began, and despite my precautions, I felt my consciousness being pulled toward their collective focus. My vision blurred. Reality seeming to fold along invisible seams, I bit my tongue hard, using pain to maintain my grip on awareness. Blood filled my mouth, warm and coppery, as I activated my recording devices with trembling hands. What happened next defies conventional description. The pit expanded suddenly, the darkness within it, not merely an absence of light, but a substance with properties of its own. It rose like a liquid, forming tendrils that reached toward the artifacts, connecting them in a network of shadowy filaments. Where these filaments intersected, tiny ruptures appeared in the air itself. Microscopic tears in reality through which something else became visible. I struggled to make sense of what I was seeing through these openings. Vast landscapes of crystalline structures under skies of impossible colors, the interior of some colossal organism, or perhaps something that human perception simply couldn't process without translating into more comprehensible imagery. My recording equipment malfunctioned, the screens displaying only static or fractured geometric patterns. The circle members now moved in perfect synchronization, their bodies serving as anchors for the expanding network of darkness. Verer's voice rose to a crescendo as he held the obsidian disc high above the pit. The disc shattered fragments hovering in midair, each piece becoming a window to somewhere else. Through one, I glimpsed what I can only describe as a city, though that word is wholly inadequate, stretching across dimensions populated by entities that shifted between states of matter as they moved through structures that simultaneously existed and didn't exist. My pyramid artifact still in my pocket began to vibrate. Violently, heat seared through my clothing, and I instinctively reached to remove it, burning my fingers in the process. As it fell to the floor, the sound it made upon impact resonated with the other artifacts, creating a harmonic convergence that split the air with a thunderclap of pressure. The ritual circle broke in confusion, the darkness receded abruptly, the microscopic portals collapsing with audible snaps. Several circle members collapsed, blood streaming from their noses and ears. Verer alone remained standing, his gaze fixing unerringly on my position, his eyes no longer human, eyes locked with mine across the distance. His lips formed words I somehow understood without hearing. You cannot stop the convergence. You are part of it. Now I ran abandoning my equipment and the pyramid artifact, fleeing through the darkened library with the sound of pursuit close behind. Not just Verer, but something else. Something that moved through shadow and solid matter with equal ease brushing against my consciousness. As it closed the distance, I burst through the emergency exit alarms blaring as I sprinted across the quad. My lungs burning and legs weakening with each step, I've barricaded myself in my office. Now using every precaution I can think of, salt lines at the threshold. Symbols of protection from half a dozen religious traditions drawn on the walls and floor. Academic rationality seems laughably inadequate against what I've witnessed. My phone shows no signal and campus internet access is mysteriously down. Outside my window, thick fog has descended. Obscuring everything beyond a few feet, occasionally shapes move within it that bear only passing resemblance to human forms. The dreams continue more vivid than waking life. In them, Verer and the Circle show me the truth that what sleeps beneath Blackwood is merely one of many such entities scattered across the world at nodal points of cosmic significance. They've slumbered since before humanity's emergence, but our civilization's expansion has disrupted the barriers that kept their dimensional frequencies separate from ours. The rituals aren't summoning something new, but rather aligning existing planes of reality that have always coexisted unseen and unfelt until now. Most disturbing of all is how increasingly reasonable this sounds to me. How the terror that initially gripped me has gradually transformed into a kind of horrified fascination. I catch myself wondering what communion with such an entity might truly mean for human consciousness. Could we evolve beyond our limited perceptions, or would we lose everything that makes us human in the process? The shadows in my office grow longer despite the desk lamp's steady glow. My reflection in the computer screen seems subtly wrong. My movements slightly out of sync. My expressions not quite my own. The vibrations have returned stronger now, making the pens on my desk roll without assistance, and the frame of my doctoral diploma tap, rhythmically against the wall. Last night I finally saw its face in my dreams, or rather I perceived whatever aspect of itself it chose to present to my limited consciousness. A vast shifting presence composed of geometric impossibilities and eyes. Countless eyes that aren't eyes but points of awareness, each one perceiving a different layer of reality simultaneously. It regarded me with something akin to recognition, as one might acknowledge a cell within one's own body that had suddenly developed rudimentary awareness. I understand now that I can't stop what's happening. Perhaps no one can. The entity beneath Blackwood has been awakening gradually for decades, reaching out through dreams and influencing subtle patterns of thought and behavior across the university. The Circle didn't initiate this process. They merely accelerated what was already inevitable. The fog outside my window has begun to demonstrate properties that fog should not possess. It forms patterns too regular to be natural and occasionally pulses with internal illumination. The vibrations in the floor have developed a distinct rhythm that I realize with horror matches my heartbeat exactly. I'm not observing these phenomena, I'm connected to them. I've made my decision when morning comes. If it comes, I will take my research and flee campus. Not in fear, but in the desperate hope that distance might weaken whatever connection has formed between me and what dwells beneath Blackwood. Already I feel the pull lessening when I imagine being elsewhere, suggesting its influence may have geographic limitations. But even as I plan my escape, a terrible question haunts me. What if there is no escape? What if the dreams continue, regardless of distance? What if the connection once established transcends physical space entirely, and most troubling of all, what if a part of me no longer wishes to break free? The door to my office is shuddering now, though whether from someone or something attempting to enter or from the increasingly violent vibrations permeating the building, I cannot say. Either possibility seems equally terrifying and somehow equally inevitable. The fog presses against my window thick as cotton and writhing with subtle movement. Within its depths, I can almost discern a pattern similar to the symbols on Werner's obsidian disk. My head throbs in sympathy with the vibrations. The line between waking and dreaming grows indistinct. I am Dr. Thomas Harlow, professor of archaeology at Blackwood University. I am still myself for now. Story 4, I first knew something was wrong when the headlights seemed to flicker across my eyes like a pulse, too steady and yet too urgent, as if the entire night had a heartbeat of its own. The sky was moonless, and the darkness outside felt dense, pressing against the car windows in a way that made me catch my breath. It was that kind of suffocating blackness you don't usually encounter on normal roads, something deeper, as if the night itself was watching me. My lungs seemed to tighten and my throat went dry. I remember sliding a hand over my arm, the hairs there raised as if warning me I should have never left home in the first place. I was traveling alone, driving across an unfamiliar route, determined to find a quicker path to my destination. My phone's battery had died hours before, and for a while I had just followed the signs, trusting that any highway eventually leads somewhere. Yet, as the hours stretched on, the road took on an unsettling emptiness. I realized I had not passed another car in ages. My nerves frayed with every mile, my shoulders ached with tension, and I kept swallowing hard to moisten my tongue. The dryness in my mouth was becoming more and more intolerable. An eventual sputter from my engine forced me to pull over. With the hood popped open, I discovered I was in over my head. I barely knew what to look for. Steam billowed into the cold air, carrying the pungent smell of something overheated. When I tried to start the car again, it refused to respond beyond a feeble hiss. Panic rose inside me. My heart pounded so hard that my chest felt tight. I waited on the side of the road for what felt like an eternity. At one point, I glanced at my wristwatch and noticed that the second hand seemed to move in spurts, halting and then jumping ahead as if time had begun to skip. My pulse quickened. I tried to dismiss it as stress or fatigue, but nothing seemed normal anymore. Eventually, headlights appeared in the distance, a small beacon of hope. A pickup truck rolled to a slow stop next to me, and a man rolled down the passenger window, gesturing for me to approach. I couldn't make out his face at first, just the silhouette of a baseball cap and a pair of seemingly normal eyes. Gratefully, I got in, muttering my thanks in a shaky voice. The interior of the truck smelled like stale air and something faintly metallic. I tried to ignore it, grateful for any help at all. His voice was calm when he asked if I was heading west, though I remember it echoed strangely as if it originated from a hollow space. I tried not to let it bother me, focusing on my relief at being off the dark roadside. I forced a polite response, explaining where I hoped to go. The man nodded in a strange mechanical way, never once turning his head fully toward me. We drove in silence for what I assumed was 15 or 20 minutes. Something about the shadows flickering over his face began to scratch at the edges of my mind. Every so often when the truck hit a bump, I thought I saw his features distort. It was as if his skin slid an inch or two down, revealing a black void beneath. Each time my stomach dropped, I struggled to keep my breathing steady, yet I found myself staring out the window, forcing my gaze away from him, certain I was just seeing things. Then the flickering shadows played a final trick on my eyes, or so I tried to convince myself. In my peripheral vision, I saw his face shift all at once, revealing pure darkness where flesh should have been. It snapped back into place too quickly for me to process. My throat went so dry that I coughed, sweat beading on my forehead. My heart hammered against my ribs. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. At a deserted intersection, the man abruptly pulled over and gestured that I should get out. I had barely stepped onto the pavement when the truck roared away, its taillights disappearing into the void of the night. I felt no gratitude for the ride. My legs trembled beneath me and my mind raced with disjointed thoughts. It was only then that I noticed my watch was showing a time that made no sense for how long we had been driving. It was as though we had lost hours, or gained them, I wasn't sure. That's when another vehicle materialized, headlights cutting a path through the gloom. This time it was a sedan. A friendly enough looking woman beckoned me to climb in. My instincts screamed at me to refuse, but what else could I do if I walked? I might never find civilization. Reluctantly, I slid into the passenger seat. The woman smiled, though the gesture didn't reach her eyes. Her lips stretched unnaturally wide. And again, that same flicker of sliding skin appeared before she slammed the door shut. I locked my seatbelt with clammy hands, every muscle in my body rigid with anxiety. The seat under me felt cold and somehow damp. We rode in near silence for a while, though she occasionally murmured pleasantries in a tone that felt rehearsed. I answered with polite single-word responses, fear constricting my throat again. Each time the car jolted or the streetlights cast sudden shadows, I thought I saw her face shift. My own reflection in the window was ashen, my eyes hollow with terror. When she pulled into a gas station, I almost cried with relief, hoping to find some sense of normalcy. Fluorescent lights, a convenience store, maybe a payphone. But the moment I stepped out of the car, I noticed something off. The gas station looked like it had been lifted from a photograph. The exact layout of pumps, the shape of the store's sign, the flickering overhead light. They were far too pristine, too staged. My pulse throbbed in my temples as I pushed the door open. Inside, the fluorescent light hummed loudly. A man behind the counter looked up and greeted me in a monotone voice. He had a name tag, but it was blank. The shelves were stocked with the usual snacks, but everything looked a little too similar. The same brand repeated over and over, all with identical price stickers. My scalp tingled with unease and a faint wave of nausea rose in my stomach. I asked the attendant in a shaky voice if there was a phone I could use. He told me there was a payphone outside. His words were mechanical, as though memorized. Stepping back outside into the glaring lights, I felt the air grow thick around me. I looked for a phone booth, but all I saw was a patch of asphalt and a flickering lamppost. There was no phone. I stared at. Empty space, dread slithering through my veins. Then I looked around for the woman who had driven me here, but her sedan was gone. No engine sounds, no tail lights, just emptiness. The attendant emerged from the store, repeating the same set of instructions about using the outside phone. I told him there was no phone out there, and he seemed confused, as though I had spoken in a foreign language. His face never changed expression. It remained disturbingly neutral. Trying to remain calm, I reached for a bottle of water on a shelf, my hands trembling. The plastic felt almost unreal, as if it were part of a prop set. I quickly left a few bills by the register and hurried back outside, determined to start walking if I had to. To my relief, a few minutes later, a faded SUV pulled up to one of the pumps and a man in a hooded sweatshirt got out. I approached him cautiously, sweat trickling down the back of my neck. My heart pounded so loudly I could feel my pulse in my ears. He appeared normal enough from a distance, though the harsh fluorescent light cast unnatural shadows across his features. He asked if I needed a ride, but his voice was too toneless. I tried to reason with myself that maybe he was just tired or had driven a long way. Desperate, I accepted the offer once again. As soon as we were back on the road, everything felt wrong. My compass wouldn't settle on a direction. The needle jittered wildly, spinning from north to east to south. In erratic bursts, I checked the man's dashboard and noticed that his digital clock was blinking. Nonsense characters, my breath came in shallow gasps. With each flicker of oncoming headlights, though we never once passed another vehicle, I felt my skin crawl. The road itself appeared to be changing lines, shifting in color or vanishing altogether. The outside world looked like an unfinished painting that kept repainting itself. Rolling hills one moment, dense forest the next, and then a desert-like plain. My eyes stung from trying to make sense of the impossible transitions. I could barely keep my head clear and my stomach churned with motion sickness. We passed another gas station, but it was identical to the previous one. Down to the cracked neon sign in the front, I saw the same blank-faced attendant through the window. My chest constricted at the sight, a cold sweat sliding down my face. I forced the driver to pull over, claiming I needed to stretch my legs. The moment I stepped out, I realized it was the very same station. Every detail matched from the flickering bulb in the overhead lamp to the angle of the store window. The man behind the counter gave the exact same nod. I felt my mind reeling. I retreated to the SUV, telling the driver that there must be a mistake, that we'd gone in circles, but he only stared at me, unblinking. Then, without warning, he told me he couldn't drive any further and insisted I get out. I saw that same shift again, his face slipping like a mask, revealing a black hollow where features belonged. My heart pounded so violently that my vision blurred for a moment. Then he turned the vehicle around, and before I could protest, he sped off. I was left under the harsh fluorescent glare alone, with my legs shaking so hard I thought I might collapse. The attendants at the gas station seemed oblivious to my frantic questions. I pressed them for answers, but they responded with the same rehearsed lines. One of them pointed to a sign showing a direction to the nearest town. The sign, however, was blank. I fought the urge to scream as I staggered back to the main road, determined to walk if necessary. My fear grew heavier with each step. The sky above was pitch black, broken only by distant stars that seemed to swirl and shift like oil on water. My ears picked up strange rustling sounds from the roadside, as if unseen shapes were moving just out of sight. The stench of burning rubber and singed metal hung in the air, intensifying as I continued walking. My breathing grew ragged, the taste of dread lingering in my mouth. My thoughts churned in a frantic loop, questioning whether I was caught in some bizarre dream or if I had slipped into a parallel existence. Time distorted in maddening ways. At points, I tried to gauge the hours by the movement of the stars, only to see them freeze or jerk across the sky in unnatural leaps. My watch was useless, the second hand twisting erratically. The more I walked, the more certain I became that the road itself was lengthening, stretching out like a living thing determined to keep me trapped. No matter how far I went, the horizon remained the same. My body was drenched in sweat and my chest burned with exertion. Yet I could not shake the sensation that I was under observation by something I couldn't see. Eventually, I spotted an illuminated sign in the distance, a glowing emblem that promised yet another gas station. My heart sank, certain it would be the same structure. Still, I had no alternative but to approach it. This time there was a parked car out front just sitting there with the engine running. I forced myself to approach it, each step punctuated by a throbbing in my temples. The driver's side window slid down, revealing a figure in the driver's seat. The moment our eyes met, I felt that rush of cold fear again. It was the man from the pickup truck, the first one who had offered me a ride. Only now I noticed that his eyes were too dark, the pupils impossibly wide. His expression was devoid of any human warmth. He gestured for me to get in, but I knew I couldn't endure another ride with these things. My lungs felt like they were shrinking and my pulse hammered in my wrists. My vision narrowed, the edges blurring in panic. I stumbled backward, nearly falling onto the concrete. The figure behind the wheel simply watched, face unreadable, as if he expected me to obey. Instead, I turned and ran inside the station, where the same attendant looked at me as though we'd never met. My heart was pounding so fiercely I thought I would pass out. I told him I needed help, needed a way to contact someone. He repeated that the payphone was out back. My mouth tasted bitter and I could feel my whole body shaking as I forced myself to go outside again. Rounding the corner, I actually found a phone booth this time. It hadn't been there before. Stepping inside, I fumbled with the receiver, my hands so slick with sweat I could barely keep hold of it. My breath came in panicked bursts. I dialed the only number I remembered, but the line hissed with static. Then, before I could hang up, a voice whispered my name. It was distorted, layered over with a low hum. My heart lurched. I tried to stammer out a reply, but the voice cut in and said something I couldn't fully understand, sounded like a threat or maybe a warning. Then the line went dead. I dropped the receiver and stared at it. Swinging in front of me, my pulse thuding in my ears. I felt a presence behind me. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw no one. Yet I sensed something was there. My spine tingled and my stomach lurched. I ran. I didn't care where the road led anymore. I just needed distance from that booth, from those emptiness-faced figures. My feet pounded the asphalt, lungs burning, until eventually I found myself at another identical station. I screamed in frustration, fists clenched, chest heaving. In a last desperate act, I turned off the road entirely, cutting through a patch of trees. The branches scratched at my arms and the ground was uneven. My ankles threatened to twist with every step. Yet as soon as I emerged on the other side of the tree line, I saw something that made my breath catch. The horizon was lit by the faint glow of a sunrise. The road behind me was visible, but looked somehow distant, as though receding into a dark haze. I realized I might have escaped the infinite loop of those rides, those gas stations. Stumbling forward, I discovered another highway. One that showed signs of genuine life. Scattered cars, blinking taillights, the glow of a real city in the distance. My entire body trembled with relief. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and every beat of my heart reverberated in my skull. I was panting so hard I had to fight for each breath. But with every careful step toward that city light, I felt the grip of that impossible road loosen just a bit. I don't know how many hours passed before I finally made it to a populated area. The morning air was crisp and the sun felt almost unreal on my skin. My phone started buzzing with messages all at once, as if it had been out of time and space entirely. I still can't explain what happened or how I managed to break free. Sometimes I catch my reflection in mirrors, worried. I'll see my face slip, revealing a black void beneath. Other times I'll wake in the middle of the night, soaked in sweat, certain that a strange figure stands outside my window, a driver waiting to take me back to that endless highway. I have no proof of my journey, no photographs or messages, but I can still taste the acrid fear in my mouth when I think about it. The thick stench of stale air in those trucks and sedans, the mechanical politeness of the station attendants, the way time seemed to twist like a living thing. Sometimes I wonder if I truly escaped, or if I'm just in another layer of that infernal loop, biding my time before the road finds me again. Even now, when I drive late at night, I feel my heartbeat stutter. If I glimpse headlights in my rearview mirror, I grip the wheel until my knuckles go white, because part of me knows the truth. Once that road has you, it never really lets go. I survive day by day, waiting for the next flicker in reality. The next slip of a human face, the next gas station that appears just a little too familiar. And every time the sun goes down, I feel the darkness press in, as though it's a reminder I was allowed to leave once, but nobody said it wouldn't happen again. Story 5. I could feel something was wrong the moment I stepped off the tour bus. The sky seemed darker than usual, and the mountain air tasted stale, as if it had been trapped below ground for centuries. Everything felt off, like a picture hung slightly askew or an echo in a place that should have been silent. Even before I set foot inside the cavern, my heart was already hammering in my chest, and I felt the tiny hairs on the back of my neck prickle. It was the kind of unsettling aura you can't quite pinpoint. You just know you're in the presence of something that shouldn't exist in the normal world. I had signed up for a guided excursion through the renowned caves in the region, known for their bizarre rock formations and rumored hidden passages. I've always been drawn to the unknown, but never had I anticipated the kind of dread that slowly gnawed at my insides as we gathered at the cavern's entrance. A slight metallic taste formed in my mouth, and the crisp mountain air gave way to a dank claustrophobic chill that slithered down my spine. We were greeted by a guide who introduced himself in a voice too calm, too measured. I recall him stating in passing that these caves had once been used for rituals centuries ago. He mentioned that local legends spoke of portals to other places beneath the rock, though he laughed it off as folklore. Yet his eyes didn't seem to match the casual tone of his words. In that moment, I felt a flutter of anxiety, but I brushed it aside as just another tourist's nervous excitement. Still, the deeper we moved into the winding caverns, the more I became aware that something was subtly amiss. Shadows danced across the jagged walls, and the hush of our footsteps made the air feel heavy. My flashlight beam flickered more times than I was comfortable with, and the small digital camera I brought along began to glitch. I chalked it up to poor batteries. But I also noticed that the watch on my wrist was slowing down, ticking in a bizarre, uneven rhythm. If at first it was just a few seconds behind, soon it had stopped altogether. That realization made my pulse throb in my temples. I ran my hand over my forehead and noticed small beads of sweat, even though it was cold enough that I should have been chilled to the bone. As I walked in line behind the other travelers, I saw the guide linger around certain corners. He would vanish from sight for a few seconds as though he were slipping through cracks in the wall. Then he'd reappear behind us with a strange half-smile, looking supremely composed. I tried to reassure myself that he was just doing his job, making sure no one wandered off, but it felt more like he was watching us with an intensity no normal guide would have. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of Autolove's deep recesses in the cavern walls that weren't on any official map. The guide mentioned these secret areas, describing them as unstable sections that visitors weren't allowed to explore, but his words were delivered with a strange emphasis as if he wanted to gauge our reactions. In the distance, I heard soft echoes that didn't line up with our group's footsteps, like the faint scuff of a shoe or a hushed gasp somewhere behind the rock formations. My breathing grew shallow, and I tried to tell myself it was just a normal sound distortion in a cave. Still, it gave me chills. Not long after the group approached a narrow tunnel, the guide motioned for everyone to follow him, explaining in an oddly detached tone that beyond the tunnel lay a part of the cave seldom seen by the general public. With each step, the darkness intensified and my flashlight sputtered again. As we moved forward, I could feel my heart pounding so fiercely it threatened to drown out any other sound. My clothes clung uncomfortably to my clammy skin, and the air seemed too thick to breathe properly. Just as I was about to panic, the tunnel opened into a broad cavern, dimly lit by strange mineral deposits that shimmered in the faintest trace of light. The guide pointed out unusual rock formations, but I noticed his manner had turned odd. He no longer had the blank, overly polite expressions typical of a tour guide. Instead, he looked almost sorrowful, like someone in mourning. I overheard him telling another tourist a half-whispered detail. These caves had long been rumored to be gateways to pockets of reality beyond our own. I shuddered, feeling the hairs on my arms stand up. His words felt too certain, too knowing. My palms grew slick as we pressed on, and my pulse kept spiking with every minor noise. At one point, I felt a whisper of movement behind me and whirled around. There was nothing there, at least nothing visible. The only sign that something was off was how my breath came out in short, ragged bursts, and how my heart hammered against my ribs like it wanted to escape my chest. Eventually, the guide led us down another corridor narrower than the last and then into a hidden chamber. The moment I stepped inside, I sensed a powerful shift, like I'd moved through an invisible veil. My watch, which had been running sporadically now, froze completely. A man next to me shook his phone and tapped at the screen, complaining that it had abruptly gone dead. Another person tried to turn on a flashlight app, but it refused to work. In the stale silence, I detected a subtle hum in the air. It seemed to resonate in my bones and behind my eyes. I felt the tension in my gut ratchet up several notches. My breathing was shallow again, and I could smell a faint sulfuric stench that made my nose wrinkle. The guide's voice turned low and hoarse, and there was a palpable sense of dread that nearly buckled my knees. He began describing the dimensional pockets rumored to exist in these caves. He said that sometimes at the right moment a passageway could open and draw travelers into another realm. He alluded to lost souls that roam these shadows, trapped between dimensions. He spoke of a guardian, an entity forced to remain behind whenever someone else broke free. My mind reeled, my thoughts raced, trying to find a logical explanation, yet the ominous chill suffusing this part of the cave seemed beyond rational comfort. The space was too quiet. My slightest movement echoed unnaturally loudly, as though the walls were pressing inward. My chest tightened and I felt sweat trickling from my temple. Then the guy disappeared into one of the dark aisles. No announcement this time, no explanation. He just vanished. Unable to subdue my curiosity, I edged closer to the spot where he'd gone. My heart hammered in my ears and my breathing felt constricted, as if the air itself were turning to sludge. My instincts told me to get away, but I also couldn't ignore the bizarre magnetism pulling me forward. As I peered into the recess, I glimpsed a faint glow along the rocky surface, almost like a shimmering veil. Something about it made my stomach clench. I could have sworn I saw ghostly silhouettes shifting within that glow, like shapes struggling against a barrier. My mind screamed at me to back off, but my legs refused to listen. That's when I heard him call out. His voice eerily layered, as though multiple people spoke simultaneously. He said the caves needed new souls, new watchers. He explained that these fleeting portals had to be fed, or the spirits trapped within wouldn't ever find release. His voice sounded mournful, desperate. I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my skull, as if the threat of some incomprehensible force were closing in. The others in my group began to notice the guide's absence and started murmuring nervously. A wave of panic ripped through the crowd like a contagious fever. A few people shouted in confusion, wanting to turn back. The subterranean darkness felt suffocating. I swallowed hard, trying to wet my dry mouth only to taste a bitter tang of terror. My thoughts spun around searching for a rational way out, but the gloom had swallowed any sense of direction. Suddenly, the guide reemerged, his eyes dark and imploring, his posture rigid as if held up by invisible strings. He didn't say much, merely pointed to another narrow passage that supposedly led to safety. Several tourists rushed toward it, drawn by the promise of an exit. I hesitated, my instincts screaming that something was deeply wrong, but the oppressive weight of the cavern pressed me forward, and I followed each footstep heavier than the last. The passage led to a cramped chamber where water dripped constantly from stalactites, creating a disconcerting rhythm. My heart thumped in synchrony with those drips, each beat accelerating. My breathing became labored and I gasped for air. The guide stood at the center of the chamber, motionless. With the faint illumination from someone's flickering flashlight, I could see his face more clearly. It had a translucent pallor, as if he were losing tangibility. Then I noticed his features flickering like someone adjusting a faulty TV antenna. One moment he looked like the mild-mannered guide we'd met at the entrance. The next moment his appearance was that of a tired, tormented apparition, hollow-eyed and trembling. He began sharing in a halting voice fragments of what had happened in these caves, explorers and travelers who got lost, never to return, leaving behind only rumors of their disappearance. He described how he had once been an ordinary guide, trapped here decades ago when a sudden quake sealed off the primary passage. By the time he found a way out, he'd stumbled into one of these dimensional pockets, inadvertently taking the place of a former guardian. He spoke about endless years of watching, waiting for the next group of visitors. He explained in measured but sorrowful words that if he could guide a few souls deeper into the pockets, he might finally escape his eternal sentence. In turn, someone else would have to remain as the new caretaker. My vision blurred for a moment as the horror of his confessions settled over me. A slow, icy dread flooded my limbs and my hands trembled. I felt nauseous, as if the very ground beneath me were rolling in waves of malevolent energy. Then I saw behind him, just past his flickering form, a swirling distortion in the air. It was like a faint vortex spinning quietly, waiting for an unwitting traveler to step through. I sensed a presence beyond that spinning veil. Countless silhouettes writhing, desperate to escape. Fear choked me, and I realized in a sudden moment of clarity that I had to get out of there. Others must have felt the same, because as soon as the guide lifted his arm to motion toward the swirling distortion, the group collectively recoiled. Yet the air felt strangely constrictive, as if it were actively resisting our desire to flee. The swirling portal seemed to pulse, and with each surge I felt my knees weaken. The guide's eyes burned with an expression that combined sorrow, regret, and a sliver of hope. His presence seemed to stretch as though he were being pulled in multiple directions. In the chaos, I stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the slick cave floor. My heart slammed against my ribcage and my skin prickled with goosebumps. I tasted the salt of my own sweat on my lips, and my head spun from the stale, suffocating air. The sense of being watched grew so intense that I could almost feel invisible hands grazing my shoulders. I was torn between the terror of staying and the terror of moving, but I knew I had to leave before whatever was behind that veil claimed me as a substitute. Another person in the group hissed that we should retreat to the main path. We huddled together, inching away from the swirling distortion in the guide. In that moment, I sensed the guide's disappointment. It radiated from him in a wave of sorrow. Yet I also sensed relief from the trapped souls behind the veil, as though they knew there might be other opportunities. Other unwary tourists, I took tentative steps toward a side tunnel. Blood pounding in my ears, my entire body was slick with cold sweat, and it took every ounce of willpower not to collapse in panic. The guy didn't chase us. Instead, he watched with that same grieving expression, and I had the impression that he was at war with himself. He needed new guardians, but he also loathed this role he'd been forced into. It was as though the caves themselves held him in place, commanding him to execute a task he despised. Adrenaline surged through my veins, fueling my muscles to carry me forward. My legs shook with each step, threatening to give out. But I pushed on. The sound of dripping water, the echo of ragged breathing from my fellow tourists, and the faint hum of unseen energies formed a claustrophobic chorus in my mind. Finally, we found ourselves back in a broader passage, one we recognized from earlier in the tour. Though the darkness was still pervasive, the suffocating sensation seemed to lessen. We hurried along, guided by flickering flashlights that occasionally sparked back to life. At one point, my watch ticked once more, giving a weak attempt at measuring time, but then it died again. Every heartbeat felt like an eternity. My lungs burned and my shirt clung to my back, drenched in sweat. The claustrophobic dread hadn't left me, but the path seemed to widen just enough for me to believe we were headed toward an exit. When we finally emerged into the open air, my entire body was quivering. I sank to my knees, taking huge gulps of fresh oxygen. The contrast was staggering, and for a moment I felt dizzy with relief. My heart pounded in my chest, refusing to settle. I glanced around to see if the rest of the group had made it. A few people stood nearby, bent over, hands on their thighs, breathing heavily. Everyone looked stunned, caught between fear and an odd sense of disbelief. After a moment, I found the courage to look back toward the cavern's entrance. I didn't see the guide emerge. The darkness beyond the rocky threshold seemed to swirl subtly, as if something behind it was still active. My stomach twisted at the realization that despite our escape, we'd left him, and whatever else lurked down there, still inside. I wasn't sure if he was free to leave or doomed to remain waiting for the next unfortunate group. For days after, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being followed by a lingering presence. At night, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I could hear faint echoes of dripping water and hushed whispers. My watch never worked properly again, even after I replaced the battery. And there are times when I check my phone and find it glitching for no apparent reason. Each time it happens, my heart rate spikes and I feel a creeping paranoia that I'm still tethered to that place in some unexplainable way. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stepped closer to that swirling veil. Would I have found myself pulled into a hidden dimension, forced to wander in darkness like the souls I glimpsed? Or would I have been appointed a new guardian, doomed to stand watch in the bowels of the earth for all eternity? Whenever I recall that flickering guide, his translucent features, and the sorrow in his voice, I feel a chill that even the brightest sunlight can't banish. He was in that moment the perfect embodiment of a spirit, chained to a haunted place, eternally trapped, longing for freedom. And I realized that although I escaped physically, a piece of my mind remains locked in that cavern, replaying the horror of those endless shadows, the clammy air, and the presence of something beyond the veil. Even now, every time I close my eyes, I see them, faint silhouettes behind the shimmering wall of reality, yearning to break free into our world. It leaves me with an unshakable unease, a constant reminder that some doors once opened never fully close. Story 6, I noticed it for the first time, late on a Sunday night when the city's usual hum had died to a faint echo in the distance. Something was there on my terrace, standing far too still. The sense of wrongness hit me like a physical blow. My heart lurched and I tasted metal in my mouth as my body responded with instant alarm. The figure, faintly illuminated by the single flickering bulb I keep over the doorway, cast no shadow on the cement floor. Everything else around it, pots, railings, even the broken chair in the corner, had shadows stretching in the dim light. But that figure remained oddly two-dimensional. Its shape seemed to ripple at the edges as though refusing to settle on a single outline. At first, I thought my eyes were tricking me. Then my pulse drummed in my ears loud and urgent as I realized this was no optical illusion. I had woken up because a mild breeze pushed the terrace door open, sending a sudden draft into my living room. When I got up to close it, I saw that silhouette standing there. My stomach tightened. A wave of cold sweat spread across my back. I took a slow, shaky step closer, my breath so shallow that I felt dizzy. At that exact moment, it seemed to shift. Almost as though it were turning to regard me, but there was no defining feature, no detail to anchor its face in my mind. It was as if reality itself hesitated to admit its presence. I can't fully describe the shape because every time I tried to focus on it, something subtle slid out of my field of vision. That was the beginning of a series of nights that tested my sanity. My apartment building has always felt old, as if it creaked under the weight of its own history. Doors squeak, pipes groan, and walls seemed to hold on to secrets I moved in because it was in a convenient location near my workplace. A stroke of good luck, I thought back then. Now I'm not so sure. The morning after that first sighting, I felt an odd tension in my chest as though I had narrowly escaped danger. My head ached, and I spent several minutes just staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to gather the nerve to check the terrace in daylight. But when I finally stepped outside, sunlight flooded the concrete floor, showing nothing out of place. The only evidence was the memory burned into my mind, and the gnawing sense that I wasn't alone. I installed a cheap security camera in the living room months ago, aimed loosely toward the terrace door. It was mostly for my own peace of mind in case anyone tried to break in. I remembered that it saved recordings on a small memory card. With a shaky hand, I retrieved the footage and fast-forwarded until the point I had woken up. My heart pounded as I watched grainy images of me getting up from the couch and walking toward the door. Right behind me, clearer than I had expected, was the shape. Except it appeared slightly angled in a way that made no sense, as if the camera lens itself couldn't capture it in a conventional perspective. Parts of it seemed to stretch backward at an impossible slant, like a reflection in broken glass. Even so, it was there. It had mass, but no shadow. I felt my stomach twist again. Throughout the day, I was plagued by fleeting glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. A dark blur shifting near the hall, a faint shimmer behind my reflection in the elevator mirror. Every time I turned my head, the presence was gone, leaving me short of breath and covered in cold sweat. My anxiety soared, simple tasks became fraught with tension. I found myself jumping at the hiss of my own coffee machine or the distant ring of someone else's phone in the hallway. By late afternoon, my hands were trembling and my coworkers noticed I was out of sorts. Someone asked if I was okay, and I forced a nod. Not sure how to explain any of what I had seen. That evening, I rewatched the security footage from the previous night. It was the single bravest and stupidest thing I could think to do, but I needed more answers. This time, I slowed it down to half speed. Studying the figure's vague outline, I noticed it seemed to fold in on itself, and then extend outward in a smooth, uncanny motion, like a shadow trapped between frames of film. My entire body was rigid. My breathing turned rapid, my throat uncomfortably tight. I felt lightheaded, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. Then there was a moment, maybe just a few seconds, when the figure briefly turned toward the camera. There were no eyes, no mouth, but I felt its focus like a cold finger sliding along the back of my neck. I considered telling a neighbor, perhaps the man living 2 doors down, but I remembered all those times I had passed him in the hallway, seeing the haunted look in his eyes. Instead of speaking directly, I asked him casually if he'd ever spotted anything unusual around here. He hesitated, lowering his voice. He recounted that decades ago there had been repeated sightings of a strange presence on various balconies and terraces in the building. Some said it appeared whenever someone was going through extreme emotional turmoil. He didn't elaborate much more, only hinted that it could feed on intense states like heartbreak or panic. I felt my guts twist into knots as I realized I might be dealing with the same entity. Curiosity overrode caution. I spent hours researching old archives, rummaging through online forums and municipal records. I found references, some faint, others more direct, to a shadowless intruder. Reports dated back to when the building was still new. People insisted they had encountered something that never cast a shadow, lurking in corners and peeking around doorways whenever tension ran high. And always these sightings preceded significant events. A neighbor losing his job, a sudden string of building-wide disputes, a dramatic confrontation in the lobby. Each time the presence manifested more clearly, as if it thrived on the emotional energy swirling through the halls. Knowing this didn't bring me comfort, it only deepened my dread. If the entity showed itself to me, did that mean I was on the brink of some major crisis? My mind raced. I considered every stressful point in my life, my uncertain job situation, the strained relationship with certain relatives. Was I feeding it as nights dragged on? The visits became more frequent. My security camera captured fleeting impressions of the figure, sometimes on the terrace, sometimes angled in a way that placed it halfway through the living room wall. The footage never made sense visually. It was as though each frame presented it from a perspective that defied geometry. Meanwhile, in person, I saw it only in glimpses. I would catch a ripple in the air, a faint outline in the reflection of a window. My heart hammered so violently that I grew afraid the thing could hear it. I walked around with my shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. My sleep was fractured by nightmares in which the walls bled black shapes, and I woke up drenched in sweat, my shirt stuck to my clammy skin. One time I tried to confront it head on. I had come home after a deeply unsettling day at work. My boss had announced impending layoffs, fueling my sense of dread. That night, the presence in my apartment felt suffocating. The air felt heavy and electric, causing every hair on my body to stand on end. My heart rattled in my chest and my lungs cramped with every breath. I stormed into the living room, turned on every light I could, and declared internally with furious resolve that I refused to be terrorized. I half expected to see it appear in front of me, but at first there was only silence and the low hum of the building's ancient piping. Then off in the corner by my reading lamp, I noticed the air shimmer. It was almost like a heat haze. My chest grew tight and my pulse throbbed in my ears. I forced myself to stay still, fists balled, ignoring the dryness in my throat. For a moment, I thought I heard a faint scraping sound. My skin prickled. There was an oppressive thickness in that corner, a void that my mind instinctively tried to avoid. The more I stared, the more it seemed to waver, a silhouette on the very edge of my vision. But no matter how intently I tried to fix my gaze on it, the outline refused to remain stable. My eyes watered as though my brain simply rejected the concept of that shape. Adrenaline sent tremors through my arms. I blinked, and in that fraction of a second, it vanished. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. My appetite disappeared, leaving me with a constant feeling of nausea and an acrid taste of bile in my mouth. I found it harder and harder to focus on normal life. My coworkers commented that I looked pale, as if I was coming down with a severe illness. I even went to a doctor who said my vitals were normal, but suggested that I might be under significant stress. I considered telling him about the presence, but I feared he would label me delusional. Maybe he would be right, I thought in weaker moments. Still, I couldn't let it go. My research led me deeper into the building's rumors. Allegedly, people claimed that whenever this thing appeared, an event of great emotional intensity would soon rock the residents. Some wrote that it wasn't necessarily evil, just a parasite of sorts. Others swore it manipulated events to create more tension, more emotional turmoil so that it could feed. Reading these conflicting views frayed my nerves further. I stayed up late, hunched over my desk, my eyes burning. scanning every old newspaper clipping I could find. In the flickering lamplight, the apartment took on a sinister glow. The corners of each room seemed to loom closer, and the quiet ticking of the clock became a deafening metronome of doom. Then the building manager informed everyone of a pending inspection that could result in major renovations. People began arguing over the potential costs. Voices in the corridors rose in tension. Slamming doors became routine, and stress lingered like a foul odor. My nerves were on edge. I started to suspect that the presence was goading everyone into conflict, absorbing every negative emotion that swirled through our halls. Eventually, my own involvement felt inevitable. I was singled out by a few neighbors to gather old paperwork and help rally opposition to the renovations. That same day, I experienced a new surge of dread. My heart pounded wildly at the slightest sound. Passing by the mirror in my hallway, I saw a faint reflection behind me, like a shadow that belonged nowhere. My skin turned clammy, my vision narrowed. The overhead light flickered, and for a moment I felt certain I would pass out. When I turned around, everything was empty, yet the sense of being observed was overwhelming, pressing down on me until my limbs felt heavy. Late that night, unable to sleep, I reviewed my security footage again. I forced myself to watch several hours at normal speed, dreading what I might see. My posture grew stiff, and I fought to keep my eyes open. At about 2 odd a.m. in the recording, the terrace door swung open ever so slightly, as if teased by a gentle push. The figure entered the frame, not by walking in from outside, but by leaning in from the edge of the camera's view at an impossible angle, as though gravity had no hold on it. My heartbeat resounded in my skull as I watched it raise what might have been an arm or a tendril toward the door handle. It never quite made physical contact, but the handle moved anyway, clicking shut. In that moment, the figure's shape trembled and warped, then disappeared. It reappeared closer to the camera so rapidly that I could barely register the frames in between. There it stood, filling most of the lens, an amorphous outline with no visible features. Then it faded out, leaving behind an empty living room. My hands were slick with sweat. My chest felt constricted like a steel band squeezed my ribs. That was enough for me. I slammed the laptop shut. My breathing ragged, my mind spun. Was it trying to tell me something, or was it simply tormenting me, building up my terror to feast on it? I tried to recall every story I'd read about these sightings. In some accounts, the entity would linger for days or weeks, only to vanish. The moment after some intensely emotional event occurred in the building. In others, people claimed the presence never truly left waiting in the corners of perception until the next opportunity. The nights became an endless test of endurance. My entire body was perpetually wired, as though expecting an ambush at every turn. Even my dreams offered no solace, blending the memory of that shapeless figure into twisted scenarios that jolted me awake with a pounding heart and a body soaked in cold sweat. I lost count of how many times I splashed water on my face in the bathroom sink, trying to keep my fear at bay. The fluorescent bathroom light flickered ominously, and I couldn't help thinking it was mocking me, highlighting my own frailty. As the day of the inspection approached, tensions in the building reached a fever pitch. Neighbors barely spoke without raised voices. The manager paced the lobby, muttering about budgets and possible fines. My skin prickled whenever I passed someone in the hall. Sensing the collective anxiety, I felt the entity's presence saturating the air, as though it was gorgeously feasting on all our dread and frustration. My own fear was an integral part of that buffet, and I despised how powerless I felt to stop feeding it. On inspection day, I expected the worst. The air was thick with apprehension. Most residents waited in the corridors, bracing for the verdict. My palms were slick with sweat, and my heart hammered so loudly that I found it difficult to form coherent thoughts. At some point, the building manager emerged looking exasperated. He informed everyone in a subdued tone that the inspector's report would be delayed due to new bureaucratic procedures. That meant nothing would be decided right away. The entire building sagged in collective tension, stuck in a state of limbo. People wandered back to their apartments, uncertain and annoyed. Back in my own place, I dropped onto the couch. My limbs felt drained of strength. I watched the shadows cast by my living room lamp crawl across the floor as the sun set outside. Then a prickling at the base of my neck made me look up. Over by the terrace door, I glimpsed a faint distortion in the air. My pulse throbbed. Something told me the entity was satisfied for now. Slowly, the shape coalesced, barely more than a suggestion of an outline. I could sense it was calmer, less aggressively present. My chest tightened as I realized it had been feeding on all of us this entire time. And although the crisis wasn't resolved, the tension had reached a plateau, and maybe that was enough sustenance. It hovered there, an unformed silhouette watching me, or seeming to watch me. I could feel a tremor in my hands, my breath shallow as though my body instinctively reacted to its presence. A thought flickered in my mind. Perhaps it was done, or perhaps it was only waiting for the next shock of emotional energy to erupt. I felt a wave of exhaustion crash over me. My entire body ached with stress and my mind spun with the implications. It was old. It was part of this building. It had been here for decades and it would remain long after I was gone. The figure shimmered one last time, then receded into the air. For a breathless moment, I sat there blinking away the dryness in my eyes. The lights in my apartment no longer seemed so threatening. The air felt only slightly lighter, and yet that was enough to assure me I wasn't about to faint. For the first time in days, I sucked in a full, deep lungful of air. I realized then that it might never truly be gone. This was a place to which it was bound, and my own turmoil, along with that of my neighbors, gave it power. Did that mean I was doomed to see it for as long as I lived here? Or could I find some way to starve it out by refusing to feed it with my fear? Even now, as I write these words, I can't shake that lingering feeling of being observed. The corners of my vision occasionally flicker with movement. My nights remain uneasy, sleep a fragile gift that slips away at the slightest disturbance. The building's tension hasn't vanished. It merely slumbers ready to awaken when the next crisis rears its head. I can't say I've conquered the terror, but I've learned to coexist with it. To walk through my apartment aware of the possibility that somewhere in the peripheral edges that impossible shape might appear. Angled awkwardly and casting no shadow. It hasn't appeared on my security camera in a while. The door to my terrace stays locked. Most nights, though I know locks won't stop it. I stay because something inside me wants to see if I can endure its presence to prove to myself I won't be broken by the unknown. And so I live in uneasy truce with the creature that thrives on our emotional storms. At times I swear I can sense it quietly waiting for the next wave of upheaval. When that moment comes, it will return sliding across the threshold of perception and feeding on every pulse of adrenaline. I can't fully describe the dread that realization brings me, but for now I remain. And each day I manage to keep myself from collapsing. Under that tension is a small fragile victory, a reminder that some horrors don't need to end in bloodshed to keep haunting us. The true terror lies in knowing it's out there, always watching, always waiting, and that we ourselves are the fuel for its unending hunger. Story 7. The air smelled wrong that morning, like a damp fog clinging to something rotten, though I couldn't pinpoint the source. My heart pounded in my chest the moment I stepped onto the trail, and a subtle, uneasy tingling spread along the back of my neck, almost as if invisible fingers brushed against my skin. I had run this path dozens of times before dawn, always finding solace in the solitude. But today the woods felt different. The usual serenity had soured into an oppressive hush. Even the wind seemed hesitant, caressing the leaves in strained, erratic bursts. Instead of the smooth, comforting breeze I knew so well, I told myself to ignore it. Runners often get a surge of apprehension before they settle into a rhythm, especially if they run in the early hours under a half-lit skies. I set off at a slow jog, hoping the movement would flush out my jitters, but with every step my senses sharpened. The rhythmic crunch of gravel underfoot, the rasp of my own breath. These typical noises sounded oddly amplified. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, catching only the tail end of gnarled trees or the fleeting shapes of bushes that seemed to loom at the corners of my vision. As I made my way deeper into the forest, the trail narrowed and the canopy thickened, allowing only thin spears of grayish morning light to break through. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination that twisted these slender beams into ominous shapes. My breathing was already ragged and my shirt clung to my back where sweat was gathering faster than usual. Yet I pressed on, telling myself I just needed to push through the adrenaline. Suddenly I heard a low growl, soft rumbling, and far too close for comfort. I slowed to a cautious walk. My heart rate skyrocketed, hammering against my ribs. The growl sounded again, more insistent. My mouth went dry and I could taste the metallic tang of panic on my tongue. I crouched, scanning the undergrowth. There, about 20 feet ahead, a large shape moved between two twisting trunks. At first I thought it was a large dog, maybe a stray, but then it emerged a puma. Its fur was a mixture of tawny gold and dusky brown muscles, rippling beneath a sleek coat, eyes reflecting a fierce intelligence. In an instant, the sense of being watched transformed into raw terror. Big cats are rare in these parts, especially so close to a popular running trail. But here it was, blocking my path, tail flicking with quiet menace. I swallowed hard, trying to recall the standard advice for dealing with a mountain lion encounter. Don't run. Make yourself appear large. Avoid direct eye contact, but remain aware. My legs trembled, threatening to give out from under me. Then the puma did something I couldn't reconcile with any wildlife manual. It stood on its hind legs awkwardly at first, but then with a bizarre fluidity that made my skin crawl. My breath hitched. Its body began to shift in a series of smooth, bone-deep contortions. The creature's spine elongated in ways that defied human or feline anatomy, limbs twisting until they resembled something almost but not quite human. The face, however, remained largely that of a great cat, though an unsettling flicker in its expression suggested it could change fully if it wished. Panic thundered through my veins and my lungs nearly locked. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet refused to obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from what was happening right in front of me. The half-human, half-puma figure took a small step forward. My entire body shook. I could hardly breathe, and my skin felt icy as if a frigid wind had suddenly gusted through the forest. In a voice that was more a growl than coherent speech, the creature let me know through a series of guttural sounds and incomplete words that it belonged to an ancient lineage of beings who had roamed these forests for centuries, blending with the wildlife passing unnoticed by most. I recall focusing on the cadence of its tone, an unnatural mixture of low, throaty murmurs and distorted syllables. Though it spoke only fragments, I understood the meaning as if it were etched inside my skull. It was not alone. It never had been. My chest tightened. My mind screamed at me to flee. Yet my body seemed pinned to the spot. Every hair on my arm stood on end. I felt rather than heard the creature's silent challenge to run. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, but also something akin to fascination. My legs finally jerked into action. I bolted, scarcely aware of the direction. Branches lashed against my arms and torso, leaving stinging welts in their wake. My feet pounded the ground in a frenzied rhythm, breath coming in ragged bursts that barely fed my lungs. When I glanced back, I saw no sign of the creature, that only made the fear worse. How could something so large vanish so quickly? My mind conjured images of the puma leaping onto an overhanging branch, silently stalking me from the treetops. Adrenaline spurred me on. Eventually, I stumbled out of the deeper woods and onto a more familiar gravel path near a parking lot. I collapsed, nearly retching from exertion and terror. After a few moments, I forced myself upright and sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys until I managed to unlock the door. My hands shook violently on the drive home, and the sky outside was still a bleak gray. At every shadow on the roadside, I twitched, convinced I might see that thing lurking. I kept expecting to glimpse reflective feline eyes in the rearview mirror. Back in my apartment, he locked the door and slid down against it, pressing my forehead to my knees. My heart wouldn't slow. There in the stale air of my living room, I finally began to question whether I had hallucinated. Could shock or dehydration conjure such a vivid vision? Yet my body ached and thin scratches along my arms and cheeks stung as proof that something had happened. The following night I tossed and turned, haunted by half-formed dreams. In one nightmare I was running again, but I saw the world through eyes that weren't mine. Everything was sharper, more vibrant, and laced with predatory intent. I smelled the damp earth, heard the rustle of small creatures moving in the brush. Then I would wake up in a frenzy of tangled sheets soaked in sweat, heart drumming a brutal rhythm. But the strangest changes manifested when I caught myself sniffing the air for no reason, discerning different layers of scent. Pungent car exhaust, the faint aroma of a neighbor cooking dinner 2 floors below, even the distinct musk of laundry detergent on my own clothes. My hearing also seemed unnaturally acute, picking up distant footsteps in the hallway. For a couple of days, I didn't dare return to the forest trail. My gut churned with nervous energy at the very thought of it. I stuck to well-lit city streets for my runs, ignoring how the neon glare seemed to burn my eyes more than usual. But the restlessness gnawed at me. Something inside me craved the quiet hush of the forest, and as much as it terrified me, I felt compelled to face that place again. It wasn't just my senses that were changing. One evening after showering, I noticed faint lines across my left shoulder. They looked like random streaks at first, but on closer inspection they formed a pattern reminiscent of an animal's fur markings, thin stripes that curved in a graceful arc. My stomach tightened at the sight. I rubbed at them, half expecting them to wash away, but they remained. Over the next several days, more lines appeared on my other shoulder and along my ribs like a continuous design that wound across my skin. They looked like tattoos, but I had never set foot in a tattoo parlor. At work, my coworkers asked if I was feeling all right. I was jumpy, always swiveling my head at soft sounds. Lights felt too bright, even faint office chatter grated on my nerves. My boss gently hinted that I might need time off, suspecting I was suffering from stress, but I couldn't bring myself to share the truth. I wasn't even sure what the truth was. In an attempt to regain control of my life, I decided to revisit the trail one late afternoon. It was still light out enough that I thought I could outrun any illusions or real threats. A part of me hoped the forest would dispel this madness by simply appearing normal. I parked at the edge of the gravel lot, strapped on my running shoes, and started down the path. My heart hammered harder with each step into the thick canopy, but my senses simultaneously hummed with an odd anticipation. Leaves crackled with amplified clarity underfoot, and the forest scent filled my lungs. Damp bark, rich soil, a faint trace of animals. My pace was cautious, more like a brisk walk than a run. Everything around me was tinged with a raw vibrancy, as though I was on high alert for something. When I reached the spot where I'd first seen the puma, a chill zapped through me like a static shock traveling along my spine. I stood still, scanning the undergrowth. Nothing. No low growl, no shape-shifting between the trees, yet I felt watched. My breathing quickened and sweat trickled down my temple. I continued along the trail, occasionally glancing behind me as dusk settled in the forest, transformed into a maze of shifting shadows. My ears picked up the faintest crack of a branch. Somewhere to my left, I froze, feeling my pulse in my throat. Another crack, this time behind me. I spun around, fists clenched at my sides. Still nothing. But I knew something was there, or someone. A sudden wave of vertigo made me stagger. My vision blurred, and for a split second I saw the forest from a different angle. It was as though I was perched low to the ground, staring at my own back. The perspective felt predatory, as if I was observing myself through an animal's eyes. My stomach twisted in primal panic. I blinked hard and the vision vanished, but the afterimage remained burned in my mind. I could have sworn I saw muscles tensing under my own skin as if anticipating a pounce. I stumbled forward, wanting nothing more than to escape, but also compelled to keep moving. My breath came in short, ragged bursts echoing the furious pace of my heart. My skin prickled with goosebumps, the lines on my arms and chest tingling as if they held their own consciousness. Without warning, the undergrowth rustled. I pivoted, nearly losing my balance. There, just beyond the tangled bushes, I caught sight of those familiar reflective eyes. The puma, fully feline this time, regarded me with an intense, unsettling gaze. A sharp pang of fear stabbed through my gut. But then something else flickered in. Me. A sense of recognition, almost like greeting an old acquaintance. I felt my lips curl in an unbidden snarl, my throat vibrating with a growl I swore came from somewhere deep inside. I fought the urge to run at the creature or from it. Instead, I took a trembling step back. My rational mind wrestled with my instincts, which seemed to have frayed and re-knit themselves into something feral. The puma then slipped behind the bushes, leaving me alone with my pounding heartbeat and swirling thoughts. Over the following weeks, I struggled with a growing paranoia that seeped into my daily life. At odd moments during a conversation at work or while shopping for groceries, my vision would shift and I'd see the world through unfamiliar angles or sense the presence of animals I couldn't possibly perceive otherwise. My sense of smell and hearing reached excruciating levels of sensitivity, forcing me to avoid crowds and loud environments. The markings on my skin spread slowly, curling around my back and down one thigh. I felt them pulse with heat at times, especially at night. Sleep became a nightly battleground of bizarre dreams and near sleepwalking episodes. Once I jerked awake on my living room floor, unsure how I got there, with the faint echo of a feline growl still reverberating in my ears. My nights blurred into restless evenings of half-sleep, peppered with fleeting visions of stalking, hunting, prowling through dark woods that felt both alien and intimately familiar. My perception of reality fractured further whenever I ventured into the forest. The place drew me like a magnet, despite the suffocating dread that gripped me whenever I crossed into that realm of towering oaks and twisted underbrush. The sense of being watched never faded. If anything, it intensified. Every crackle of a leaf, every rustle of a branch felt like a deliberate sign, a signal that something ancient and intelligent moved unseen among the shadows. One evening, I confronted the creature again. It emerged from behind a massive tree trunk, neither fully puma nor fully human. Its form caught mid-transformation. The face was elongated with a mouth that seemed capable of forming words, but the eyes were purely feline, glowing with an otherworldly gleam. I recall it communicated with me in low growls and half-intelligible phrases suggesting that I was changing, becoming part of a lineage older than civilization itself. In that moment, I couldn't tell if I was standing on two legs or crouched on all fours. My mind reeled with the possibility that I was losing the ability to distinguish between my human identity and the creeping animal presence within. Afterward, I began to realize that these visions and physical changes were leading me towards some kind of transformation. My arms and legs felt stronger, my reflexes improved. I could leap up a short flight of stairs with unnatural ease. My sense of paranoia, however, soared to dizzying heights. Every corner harbored a threat, every shadow a watcher. The tension ate at me like a parasite. I could practically hear my own pulse thrumming in my ears. Then came the final confrontation, or perhaps revelation would be more accurate. Under a moonless sky, I found myself once again in the heart of the forest. No one knew I was there. I had told no one. I had turned off my phone, desperate for silence and clarity. My footsteps guided me to a secluded clearing ringed by ancient moss-draped trees. The air felt charged thick with energy that made my skin prickle as though tiny needles pressed against me. And there it was, the puma in a near-human stance, watching me from the center of the clearing. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and I realized those eyes were now oddly mirrored in my own reflection. The same predatory shine, the same primal intensity. I felt my heart hammering so violently that it bordered on pain. My breathing became shallow, but I forced myself not to look away. Despite every rational part of me screaming in terror, a deeper instinct compelled me to hold its gaze. The creature seemed to nod, and in that moment I sensed acceptance, a twisted welcome of sorts. My skin burned, and the markings along my arms and chest felt alive, pulsing in sync with my heartbeat. I half expected my bones to shift and contort, right then turning me into a mirror image of the beast. A swirl of dizziness washed over me, and for a moment all sense of reality blurred. I tasted the night air on my tongue as though it were a tangible substance. Scented every blade of grass, felt the primal heartbeat of the forest. I'm not sure how long I stood there. No words were exchanged, only an unspoken understanding that I was forever altered. Then the creature melted into the darkness. Leaving me alone in the clearing, I forced my feet to move to find my way back out of the woods. Though every fiber of my being yearned to remain, I wish I could say that afterward. My life went back to normal. It didn't. Those markings never faded. They remain intricate reminders of a legacy I still don't fully comprehend. My senses remain heightened, occasionally plunging me into terrifying episodes where I see through the eyes of predators that roam the forest. Even in my home with doors locked and curtains drawn, I sense movement out there in the shadows, and awareness brushing against my thoughts like a gentle but insistent whisper. Sometimes on moonless nights I wake to find myself gazing out the window, my reflection marked by that same feline intensity. My breath comes in slow, deliberate draws, and I can hear the forest calling me back. Whether it's truly a call or just my imagination, I can't say. All I know is that the boundary between my world and that ancient domain has thinned, and there's no way to seal it again. I won't pretend I've come to terms with it. The paranoia hasn't faded. It's just become part of me. My own reflection feels alien on certain days, and everyday noises sometimes explode in my skull, forcing me to retreat into dark, quiet spaces until the sensations subside. It's an existence always on edge, forever caught between two forms of being, never entirely comfortable in either. Yet there's also a simmering exhilaration that I can't deny. I sense hidden energies pulsing beneath the surface of the mundane. It's as if the forest's ancient heartbeat now echoes in my chest, forcing me to acknowledge that what I once believed impossible may only be hidden by the barriers of human perception. When the wind rustles the leaves outside my window, I sometimes bristle like an animal hair, standing on end heart, thumping in fierce anticipation, listening for the faint growl that began it all. And now, though I've tried to chronicle these events as a warning or a plea, I realize I'm still drawn to the forest. That place haunts me, but it also feels like a second home I never asked for. I know I can't keep running from it because ultimately I'm not sure I want to. Perhaps that's the most unsettling part, the gnawing suspicion that my transformation is far from complete and that a part of me is waiting with bated breath for the final change. So I remain here in uneasy limbo, every nerve on edge, uncertain of what I'll become and keenly aware that something ancient pads through the darkness, guiding me toward answers I'm not ready to face. The fear sits in my throat, thick and unrelenting. My hands still tremble when I recall the puma's hybrid form, its half-human lips curling into what may have been a grimace or a smile. I will never forget that moment when I realized the forest was alive with secrets, and I was no longer just an outsider. I had become part of its living, breathing tapestry, whether I liked it or not. Story 8. The wind howled across the asphalt with a low, mournful cry, and for one suffocating instant I felt as though the entire highway stretched out in front of me like a hungry maw. My headlights punched two glaring holes through the darkness, revealing little beyond chipped lane dividers and a thin veil of fog creeping in from the shoulder. Something about that night felt off, like the road itself watched my every move, anticipating that I would make one wrong turn that would lead me into its clutches. The steering wheel felt clammy under my hands, and a bead of sweat traced the curve of my neck. Despite the nippy chill in the air, I was too uneasy to pay attention to anything but the white lines and the tightness in my chest. But I couldn't shake the impression that I wasn't supposed to be there, that there was some unwritten warning to stay away. I had been driving across state lines all evening trying to outrun a complication that had followed me for too long. It started a week before when I first sensed that someone or something trailed me wherever I went. Every time I rounded a bend or pulled into a rest stop, I felt eyes fixed on my back. Glimpses in the rearview mirror, fleeting shadows that seemed to shift as soon as I focused on them. At first, I brushed it off as fatigue, but the feeling grew stronger. I'd catch sight of a hooded silhouette in the distance or sense a presence in my blind spot that would vanish if I dared to look too directly. My plan was to keep driving until dawn, just keep going straight, refusing to stop except for gas if absolutely necessary. But sometime around midnight, I took an exit that wasn't on my GPS. I remember seeing a sign with peeling letters that read Harbor Bridge, a place I had never heard of in my entire life. Still, it appeared on the side of the highway like some official route, and in my haste to dodge the presence I felt behind me, I turned the wheel sharply and found myself on this narrow, twisting two-lane stretch that looked almost abandoned. Once on it, the pavement narrowed further and the usual reflectors vanished. Soon the route was half swallowed by the gloom, and every attempt to locate a radio station resulted in static-laden silence. I tried to turn back. I slowed and scanned the roadside for a U-turn or another exit ramp. Anything that would reconnect me to the main highway instead. The shoulders dropped off into an endless field of tall grass so thick I couldn't see beyond the first row of stalks. Whenever I thought I spotted a side road, it faded into a blur of shadows like a mirage dissolving as I approached. Gripping the wheel, I felt my breathing hitch. My own pulse pounded in my eardrums. There was no barrier or fence, just an eerie sense that if I veered off the asphalt, I might slip into an unearthly void. At some point, I noticed the warning signs that started popping up by the roadside. They were scrolled in old chipped paint that glowed weakly when my headlights passed over them. Dead end, or under construction, or last service for 100 miles. Every single placard looked older than anything from recent memory, and half the letters were missing as if time had eaten away at the metal. With each sign, my anxiety rose, my throat went dry, and my hands trembled on the wheel. My car's interior seemed oppressively small, the stale scent of coffee from the cup holder turning my stomach. The strangest part was that none of these destinations, none of these cautionary phrases appeared on my GPS. The device simply showed my icon floating in a void, the digital map failing to load any data. It was as if I had stepped off the charted territories and into something that existed outside the normal boundaries. I tried to reason that maybe my GPS had lost signal, that maybe I had found a decommissioned highway. But the sense of foreboding grew stronger with every passing minute. The moment I realized I was no longer in a wholly earthly place came when I saw an old gas station up ahead. It had the kind of neon sign that used to be popular decades ago, flickering in and out with an electric hum. I felt a flicker of relief, hoping for a chance to refuel and maybe ask for directions. But as I rolled closer, that relief turned into dread. The station was empty. No other cars, no sign of life inside. The pumps were from an outdated era, the price boards listing numbers that made no sense compared to modern-day prices. Thick cobwebs hung off the nozzles, and a single overhead lamp illuminated the pumps with a nauseating yellowish glow. I forced myself to step out of the car, noticing at once that the air was stale and unmoving. It reminded me of standing in a mausoleum, still musty and too quiet. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached for the nozzle to fill the tank. Something in the silence made my scalp tingle. There was a moment just after the latch clicked into place when I thought I heard footsteps behind me, a soft crunch of gravel. When I spun around, I saw no one, but there was a shape off in the distance standing near the edge of the lamp's glow. A tall figure wearing a dark jacket and a hat low over its face. I couldn't distinguish features, just that shape. For a second, I felt my lungs constrict and sweat traced clammy lines down my temples. Instinct told me that whoever that was had been following me from the highway. I yanked the nozzle out, prematurely, hopped back behind the wheel and turned the ignition. The figure didn't move. I watched from the side mirror the station's flickering lights reflecting off the windows. Then, just as my tires squealed out of that parking lot, the station itself vanished behind me. 1 second it was in my rearview mirror, the next it was like I had passed an invisible threshold, and there was nothing but an empty stretch of road behind me, not even the gentle glow of those flickering neon lights. My stomach churned. time started losing its shape. I found myself driving for what felt like hours, but the clock on my dashboard insisted it had only been minutes. Adrenaline surged, making my muscles tense. My neck was stiff from whipping my head around at every fleeting motion in the corners of my vision. Now and then I saw what looked like the same gas station sign appear again on the horizon, only to round a corner and see that the road had changed direction. And those roadside signs continued to appear, signs bearing words that weren't logical warnings, soul pit wraiths crossing no return. My breath grew shallow and a cold sweat dampened my shirt. I realized with a jolt that these so-called destinations didn't belong to any map I knew of. This was no ordinary route. I tried to recall stories I had read or rumors I had heard about haunted highways and cursed roads. Most of them sounded too sensational to be believed. Yet here I was, driving through a place that seemed to slip in and out of reality. The pavement began to crack. The lines in the center turned from white to a deep red, as though painted with an otherworldly pigment. Occasionally, I caught sight of shapes darting between the tall grass on either side, figures that seemed half glimpsed but definitely human in outline. Every time I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck and my breath stuck in my throat like a hot lump of coal. The entity that pursued me grew bolder. I was sure of it. In my rear-view mirror, the shape would flicker into view, hanging back at just the right distance so I couldn't see it clearly. Sometimes I heard a slow, deliberate scraping sound echo through my mind, though I couldn't figure out whether it was a noise from the road or something far more sinister. My eyes burned from trying not to blink, certain that if I closed them for too long, the figure might appear in the passenger seat. At one point, I passed a battered sign that read Exit 13, Cassowary Falls. I slowed down. Cassowary Falls was not anywhere I recognized, but I was desperate to leave, to find any road leading out of this labyrinth. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I turned onto the ramp. The ramp itself was covered in leaves and debris. It dipped into a ravine shrouded in mist, then rose sharply around a hairpin turn. As soon as I navigated that bend, the entire ramp ended in a blocked passage, as though it simply had never been finished. The barrier seemed ancient, covered in moss and rust. Frantic, I tried to reverse, only to find the ramp had changed behind me, twisting into dense undergrowth. My chest seized, my breaths came in short. Ragged gulps and sweat clung to my palms. There was no choice but to drive back the way I came, praying the road would let me through again. When I merged back onto that ghostly highway, the interior of my car smelled like damp earth and iron. I locked the doors, irrational, perhaps given what was happening, but I needed some semblance of control. My arms and legs were shaking, and my mouth felt so dry it was difficult to swallow. I forced my eyes on the road, ignoring the occasional scraping that drifted in the air. Then I saw movement to my left, and a feeling of dread slammed into my gut. The same tall figure in dark attire was now driving a battered car alongside me. Its window was tinted, or maybe shrouded in darkness, so I couldn't see the face, but I felt its attention, a piercing gaze that cut through the glass. My hands went numb around the steering wheel. Without direct words, I grasped that it demanded something from me. My energy, my spirit, maybe my determination to survive. I had heard whispers about a collector of souls from road mishaps, a traveler of hidden byways who hunted those vulnerable enough to stray onto certain cursed routes. My mind reeled, trying to process how or why I had fallen into this. Meanwhile, the battered car matched my speed engine. Rumbling ominously, I swerved, trying to put distance between us, but the entity adapted effortlessly, as if following a script long since memorized. I thought of rolling down my window to shout something, but my throat burned with terror and I clamped my mouth shut. When I shifted my focus back to the road ahead, the battered car vanished again, leaving nothing in the adjacent lane but swirling fog. My heart thrashed in my chest and I felt a primal instinct telling me to accelerate. The needle on my speedometer climbed, but the road seemed never-ending. The lines in the middle blurred. The cracked asphalt swirling beneath my tires in a dizzying pattern. Eventually, the environment around me shifted. The air took on a smoky scent, and I noticed faint glowing lights in the distance. Another service station or so it appeared. The sign overhead flickered. Miller's Pit Stop. Desperation took over. Even though the previous station had disappeared the moment I left, some fragile hope in me wanted to try once more. Maybe I'd find a payphone or some other driver who'd gotten lost. I turned in, and the headlights illuminated a scene straight out of a fever dream. The entire parking lot seemed to ripple as though it was half submerged in water. The store's door hung off one hinge, squeaking each time a night breeze swept through. A broken vending machine leaned against a wall, its glass shattered and innards gutted. Overhead, the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry insects. I heard the faint crackle of an old radio from within the dark store. Muffled words I couldn't quite make out. My heart pounded so hard that my ribs ached. After gathering the courage to exit the car, I tried to step inside. The interior smelled of mold and stale coffee. A single overhead light swayed, casting shadows that danced across the floor. Rows of empty shelves stretched out in front of me, their metal surfaces caked with thick layers of dust. I could hear my own breath echoing in the silence, shallow and ragged. Then I sensed a movement behind one of the aisles. A silhouette, tall, slender, wearing that same dark jacket, stood at the far end of the store. I didn't see a face, just the unmistakable posture of someone waiting. My stomach clenched as I felt an urge to back away. Instead of speaking aloud, I tried to steady my breath and remind myself I had to keep going. I backed out of the store, never turning my back on that figure. The presence of it, like a gravitational pull, made my skin crawl. Outside, the air itself seemed to weigh on me, thick and oppressive. I stepped backward until my spine met my car door, fumbled for the handle, and got in. The moment I shut the door and locked it, the store's lights flickered out. Darkness consumed the building in the blink of an eye. My entire body shuddered, and a tremor ran from my shoulders down to my toes. In the glow of my headlights, I noticed another sign near the station exit. "You are trapped here." My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was an elaborate illusion, or I was losing my sanity from fatigue, but I could still feel the adrenaline surging through my veins, and the seat beneath me felt horribly real. Confirming that this wasn't just some nightmare, I turned the key in the ignition and tore out of the gas station, the tires squealing against the cracked pavement. Somehow, the road I rejoined wasn't the same one I had driven in on. The lane dividers were now an eerie, luminescent green, and the terrain on either side was a barren wasteland under a starless sky. A new wave of dread washed over me. My eyes darted around, searching for anything familiar, but the environment was alien, like I had slid into a realm that mirrored my world while being impossibly different. A single large sign loomed ahead. No exit. My pulse roared in my ears, and each breath felt like a jagged blade cutting my throat. Yet deep down, something forced me to keep driving. I didn't know if I was heading toward salvation or deeper into the snare. But stopping felt even more dangerous. My thoughts swirled with panic. 1,000 questions with no answers. Why me? How do I escape? What does this entity want without warning? The battered car appeared behind me again, like it had always been there, just waiting. Its headlights cut through my rear window, making it impossible to see inside the vehicle. The engine revved, and I felt that presence as a weight pressing on my psyche. My nerves screamed for me to accelerate, so I stomped on the gas. My own car lurched forward, the speedometer climbing as the pavement rushed beneath. The battered car matched every maneuver. We soared past twisted metal signs that seemed to warp the air around them. My hands cramped on the wheel, sweat making it slick. Fear pulsed through me, a tangible force. All at once, the battered car swerved, cutting in front of me. My tires shrieked as I slammed on the brakes. My vehicle fishtailed, nearly smashing into the guardrail that appeared out of the darkness at the road's edge. I fought for control, stomach lurching. Adrenaline coated my tongue in bitterness. The battered car blocked my path, forcing me to stop in the middle of that cursed highway. My muscles felt wired, and my vision narrowed to a panic tunnel. The shape in the driver's seat shifted, and I sensed that this was a final confrontation. I heard a scraping sound outside my door like nails on metal. In a moment of clarity, a thought struck me. The only way out might be to reject the fear fueling this cycle. Something about this ghost road thrived on dread illusions and isolation. It wanted me to falter, to give in to panic. I took a shaky breath, forcing my heartbeat to steady, even though every nerve in my body screamed otherwise. My breath stuttered, but I managed to exhale slowly. Then I revved the engine, and instead of fleeing backward, I steered around that battered car, grazing its fender with a sickening scrape. The action felt impossible, like I was defying gravity in a dream. My headlights revealed the path ahead, a swirling corridor of darkness and flickering lights. With a raw shout, one that tore at my already raw throat, I pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The battered car gave chase. But something changed. The lines on the road began to flicker. The oppressive feeling in the air wavered, like the very fabric of that realm was being disrupted. My entire body trembled, sweat drenching my shirt. My eyes stung from the dryness of terror, and tears pricked the corners from sheer intensity. But I kept going, pushing my engine to the edge. The battered car fell back, headlights shrinking in my mirror. I saw the silhouette shift, but it was losing ground. It was as if my refusal to surrender broke the cycle. Just when I thought the road might trap me forever, I noticed a dull glow on the horizon, faint, yet undeniably real. I kept the gas pedal down, ignoring the chaotic swirl of shapes at the edges of my vision. My breath came in ragged bursts, my chest burning, but something propelled me forward. The battered car's lights flickered once more and disappeared behind a curve. I refused to slow down. Suddenly, the smooth surface of a modern highway opened in front of me. The battered car was gone. My hands shook so badly I nearly lost control of the steering wheel. My heart hammered and my chest reverberating down to my fingertips. Streetlights, real? Streetlights lined the sides of the road, illuminating new signs that displayed recognizable place names. My GPS flickered back to life, showing the little car icon on a proper known highway. Relief and uncertainty battled within me. I felt like I had been vomited out of a nightmare into a world that was almost too bright, too tangible. I pulled onto the shoulder, chest-heaving heart still pounding like a drum in my ribs. My body was drenched in cold sweat, and my arms quivered with leftover adrenaline. When I dared to look back, I could see no hint of that ghostly route. No battered car, no looming figure in the gloom. I opened the window just a crack, letting in fresh air that cleared the stale, suffocating stench that had clung to me in that place. For several minutes, I couldn't bring myself to move. My legs were jelly, and my mind reeled with confusion and lingering terror. The sense of being watched never fully left, but it was now subdued like a dull ache after a severe wound. I checked the time on my phone. It was earlier than I expected, as though the night had collapsed in on itself. Could the entire ordeal have taken only a single hour? I have no concrete explanation for what happened on that phantom highway. Even now, recalling those endless signs and the deserted station sends a chill across my shoulders. There are times I swear I catch a glimpse of that battered car in my rearview mirror on particularly foggy nights, but when I blink, it's gone. Driving at night has never been the same. I still feel the road hum beneath my tires, but now it reminds me of something alive, something that might shift at any moment and pull me back into its hidden, haunted corridor. I left that place physically, but there's a part of me still trapped in those ghostly lanes, haunted by an entity condemned to roam for all eternity. Sometimes during late drives on empty roads, I get that prickling at the back of my neck again. I grip the steering wheel, my heart thrumming, and remind myself to stay calm. Because I know if I give in to panic, if I let the fear swallow me whole, I might find myself back on that unmarked exit, merging onto a highway that doesn't belong to this world, and this time I may not be able to break free. That knowledge lingers, a constant reminder that certain roads are better left untraveled. Even if I've escaped, the memory of that haunted path refuses to fade. I can't tell whether I uncovered some cursed secret of our roads, or if I simply fell prey to my own unraveling mind. But that sense of dread, that echo of scraping metal and flickering headlights stays with me, whispering that there are realms just beyond our line of sight, and I tremble at the thought of what might happen should I ever wander onto that highway again. Story 9. The wind whipped against my face the moment I stepped out of the car, carrying with it a sharp bite that made the hair on my arm stand on end. I had barely parked at the edge of the long gravel driveway when I noticed how quiet the surroundings were. A dense curtain of pines encircled the property, and a sickly yellow glow seeped through the windows of the house, flickering as though the electricity were about to fail. My heart thudded uncomfortably hard in my chest. Even at a distance, something about the place felt skewed, like a photograph taken from the wrong angle. That initial impression never left me. It only intensified. The moment I turned the key in the front door, I had rented the house for a solitary getaway, hoping to clear my head from the grind of city life. The listing showed sunlit rooms, a polished wooden deck overlooking a small lake, and furniture that seemed eclectic but welcoming. As I stepped inside, however, the entire vibe felt off. The air was stale, carrying the faint odor of something damp and old. Dust motes hovered under the single overhead light in the foyer, swirling around in lazy, disconcerting patterns. My breathing hitched as I struggled to rationalize the uneasy feeling creeping along my spine. A small voice in my mind told me to turn around and leave right then, but I pushed it down, chalking it up to nerves. I dragged my luggage into the living room, noticing that it looked smaller than I remembered from the photos. The ceilings were high enough, but the walls seemed to close in on me. My footsteps sounded too loud against the hardwood floors, and every slight echo made me jerk around, convinced someone stood behind me. I could feel my pulse racing, the blood rushing to my ears as if warning me that something wasn't quite right. When I found the light switch near the fireplace, my stomach twisted in confusion. The walls were adorned with crooked paintings I didn't recall seeing in any advertisement. One depicted a sprawling forest from a perspective that felt unnatural. Too many trees too close together. Another showed what seemed like the same living room, but from a vantage point near the ceiling, as if the painter had been clinging to the rafters. My chest tightened as I examined the paintings one by one. The final painting in the row seemed to show two shadows overlapping in front of a window, but the outline of the figures was blurred as though captured mid-movement. I told myself it was local art, maybe left behind by the owner. Still, it felt personal in a way that unsettled me. My skin turned clammy, and I felt a sheen of cold sweat beat on my forehead. It was more than just odd decor. There was an undercurrent in the air, almost like a low hum I couldn't pinpoint. I swore I heard a faint buzzing, but it stopped whenever I tried to concentrate on it. I tried to distract myself by locating the bedroom. A narrow hallway led to a single modest space with a bed, a wardrobe, and a single window. It was dark, so I flipped on a lamp near the bed and froze. The lamp's light cast a murky circle, making the corners of the room loom with heavy shadows. I felt an almost electric charge in the air, as if static were crawling across my skin. The bed itself looked slept in with wrinkled sheets that didn't smell laundered. My throat tightened. The listing had promised a fully cleaned rental. Why would the bed look like someone had just rolled out of it over the next few hours? I attempted to settle in. I put my groceries in the fridge, stowed clothes in the wardrobe, and made a quick meal. Every step felt like I was moving underwater, battling a slow, suffocating tension that wrapped itself around my torso. I tried turning on the TV to drown out the suffocating silence, but the channels were mostly static. An old movie crackled through the screen at one point, but the images bled into each other in a disorienting manner, making me dizzier the longer I watched. Night fell more quickly than I expected. The darkness outside swallowed any sign of the lake or the pines, leaving only the moon hovering between sparse clouds. I noticed something peculiar when I glanced out the living room window. For a moment, it looked like the reflection on the glass was moving independently of me. I blinked and leaned in. My breath fogging the glass, my reflection blinked at the same time, turned its head slightly, then lined back up with my actual movement. I stepped away, heart pounding so forcefully that my chest ached. Maybe I was just stressed, I thought, a trick of the light. Nothing more. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the house set my nerves aflame. My breathing was ragged and my muscles were tight enough to ache. Then just as I began to drift off, something outside the bedroom door shuffled. I held my breath, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. The footsteps were soft, almost careful, as if whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. Minutes crawled by and I felt a trail of cold sweat slip down the back of my neck. Then the noise stopped. I forced myself to check the hallway, flicking on lights as I went scanning each corner for any sign of an intruder. I found nothing but shadows. By morning, the house felt different, as if the walls had shifted during the night. The hallway seemed a fraction longer. The living room smelled faintly of coffee, even though I hadn't made any. A thick sense of disorientation clung to me as I poured a glass of water in the kitchen. My hand trembled so much that I spilled some on the counter. My mouth was dry, every gulp felt like I was swallowing gravel. All the while, that oppressive hum pulsed in the background. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was like being trapped near high-voltage wires. Feeling a subtle vibration in the air without knowing the source, I decided to walk around the property in hopes the fresh air would clear my head. Outside, the morning sun offered no comfort. The lake shimmered with an odd grayish hue, and the forest around it appeared hazy at the edges, as though I were looking at it through heat waves. When I circled back to the front, I saw something that knotted my stomach. Footprints leading to the door, the same pattern of soles I was wearing. But I had entered through there only once, and my prints should have washed away in the night's drizzle. Yet these looked fresh, as if someone else with my exact shoe size had arrived that morning. Later that day, I managed to speak with the property manager by phone, though the call was riddled with static and cut out every few seconds. He said the house was definitely mine to rent and that no one else had access. Still, the conversation left me uneasy. His tone was oddly formal, almost patronizing. He assured me in clipped phrases that no one had complained about strange happenings there before. After we hung up, I had the disturbing sensation that he had been speaking to me from somewhere inside the house. The static made it impossible to know for certain. My appetite vanished as the day wore on. I tried to read a book from a shelf in the living room, but the words on the page seemed to shift as if entire paragraphs had been replaced by indecipherable text. I remember flipping back a few pages, certain I had read something about a dividing line and overlapping truths. But when I looked again, it was just a blank section with faint black smudges. I hurled the book across the room in frustration. My chest was so tight and my breathing so shallow that my arms tingled. That evening, as dusk settled, I heard a door slam somewhere upstairs, but there was no upstairs in the original listing. Just one floor and a small attic for storage. My skin prickled. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, swallowing hard as I ventured into the hallway. A trap door in the ceiling led to the attic. I tugged on the cord and a narrow ladder extended downward. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, each sound echoing through the silence. The attic was cramped, littered with boxes that looked half-rotten. Dust-laden cobwebs hung in corners, shifting in a breeze I couldn't locate. My flashlight flickered and I felt a surge of fear claw at my throat. Then faintly I heard someone whisper my name, but it sounded distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. The voice sent waves of shivers down my spine. My grip on the flashlight tightened so much that my knuckles ached. Despite the dryness in my mouth, I felt nauseated, as if my body were rejecting the entire situation. I thought I sensed a shape moving behind the boxes. But when I approached, there was just a dusty mirror leaning against the wall. In the mirror's reflection, though, I glimpsed a figure stepping away. Someone dressed exactly like me. I spun around, my heart thumping so loudly it nearly drowned my senses. But the attic was empty. I staggered back to the ladder and scrambled down, nearly slipping in my haste. Once the trap door was slammed shut, I stood trembling in the hallway, struggling to catch my breath. Time started playing tricks on me. I discovered that whenever I checked the clocks, none of them matched. The one on the stove might read 7:15. The microwave would flash 8:42. while my watch insisted it was only 6:50. My phone's battery drained in minutes, making it impossible to keep track of anything. Even the sunlight seemed inconsistent, as if day and night were exchanging places according to a rhythm I didn't understand. At some point, I noticed that the paintings on the wall had changed. The frames were the same, but the images were different. The forest scene now included a glimpse of the house from outside with two silhouettes at the window. The living room painting showed a man standing by the fireplace, my own posture and build. But he was facing away from the painter's perspective. And in that final painting, the blurred figures were more distinct. They both looked like me, but one had a slight tilt to his head that I recognized as my own gesture whenever I was confused or frustrated. The realization that I might be both figures drained the color from my face. I felt my hands quake and my body broke into a cold sweat that made my shirt stick to my back. Later that night, while I tried to calm myself in the living room, the door to the deck suddenly flung open on its own. A blast of cold air rushed in, and with it came an impossible sight. Beyond the threshold, instead of the wooden deck and lake, I saw a vast desert under a starless sky. The wind carried grains of sand that pattered against the doorframe. It was a different world, or at least it felt that way. My heart hammered so violently that I could barely keep myself from dropping to my knees. By the time I blinked again, there was just the usual view of the deck. The door slammed shut, rattling the glass in its frame. I retreated to the bedroom, feeling my sanity slipping with each breath. The bedroom's window now looked onto a desolate, rocky landscape, completely at odds with the pine forest outside. My stomach lurched each time I blinked the view. Flickered between that barren wasteland and the familiar line of trees, I forced the curtain shut. Heart-pounding tears threatening to spill from the sheer suffocating anxiety. As midnight approached, though I couldn't be sure of the exact time, I felt an overwhelming pressure in my chest as if the air itself had thickened. I paced around the living room, ignoring the bizarre paintings, trying to keep my breathing steady. I had the absurd thought that if I stayed calm, maybe the house would too. Then came the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Steady, determined footsteps. I froze. They weren't trying to hide this time. When I turned, I saw him. A man with my face dressed in my clothes standing at the edge of the hallway. His eyes looked wild, as if he'd spent days wrestling with horrors. He reached out with a trembling hand, but I backed away, terror seizing every muscle. There was no question he was me, or maybe I was him. In that moment, my heartbeat threatened to burst my ribcage. My breath came in uneven gasps, and my fingertips tingled from lack of oxygen. The house lights flickered, casting everything into a strobe of weird shadows. He seemed as scared of me as I was of him. The next time the lights flickered, he was gone. I was left alone. Trembling so violently that my teeth chattered, I collapsed into a chair, trying not to hyperventilate. The hum in the air was deafening now. I realized with dawning horror that the house existed in multiple realities at once, and that I might be the intruder. Maybe in another layer of truth, I owned this place, and the man I saw was just as terrified by my presence. The following morning, objects began, vanishing and reappearing at random. A simple pen I'd been holding would disappear mid-sentence, and moments later I'd find it in the kitchen covered in dust as if it hadn't been touched for years. The fridge door kept popping open on its own, revealing an interior stocked with items I never bought. In one instance, a coat of mine reappeared with a different color. My sense of identity felt as though it were cracking. If I was noticing these changes, how many more shifts were I not seeing? I soon discovered that random strangers appeared at the property, greeting me by name, acting like old friends. Their faces blurred in my memory the instant they left. Whenever I asked them how they got inside, they responded with puzzled looks or half answers, none of which made sense. Some addressed me as the owner. Others looked confused when I mentioned renting the place. My heartbeat pounded in my ears whenever one of them left through a door that led to a corridor I swore didn't exist 5 minutes ago. Desperate, I decided I had to leave. The house wasn't just unsettling, it was eroding my grip on reality. I packed my bag in a frenzy, heart-hammering hands, sweating so profusely that I had trouble zipping my luggage. Once I was ready, I went out to the car. The driveway seemed wrong, like it curved in a new direction. I put the key in the ignition, but the engine refused to turn over. As I looked up from the steering wheel, I saw a second version of my car parked beside mine, old rust spots on its door that I didn't recognize. The sight made me want to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was painfully tight and my mouth felt as dry as sandpaper. I flung open the car door and stumbled back into the house, intending to call for any sort of assistance. The phone line produced only static. My cell was completely dead. The walls of the house felt as though they were buzzing, each surface vibrating with palpable energy. My eyes darted to the living room window. Outside, the pine forest was flickering, replaced intermittently by that endless desert, or a swirling purple sky stray with foreign constellations. The hallway stretched twisting at an impossible angle as though the architecture were folding in on itself. I felt a rush of vertigo and forced myself to sit on the floor. My chest heaved with every rapid breath, and I pressed the palms of my hands to my temples, trying to block out the spinning madness. Eventually, the flickering stabilized, leaving the house in its original form, but that sense of layered realities remained. Each door could lead to a place that was both familiar and alien. I felt the house breathing around me like a living thing. Summoning my courage, I decided to confront whatever waited in the hallway. Walking with measured steps, heart thundering in my ribcage, I turned each corner carefully. The air was thick and cold. I could almost taste metal, a tang on my tongue. A single door at the end drew my attention, even though I was certain there had been no such door before. My breath was shallow, adrenaline pulsing through my limbs. My skin crawled with goosebumps as I approached. With a trembling hand, I turned the knob. The door opened to the same living room I had just left. But standing there by the window was the man who shared my face. He stared at me, and I realized he was just as trapped in his own version of events. Our eyes met in a moment of silent terror and understanding. His lips moved as though he were about to speak, but no sound emerged. In that same flickering instant, the room shifted. It was as if I were looking at the walls from his perspective across some invisible boundary. The tension in my body reached an unbearable pitch. I stepped backwards, slammed the door shut, and found myself alone again in the hallway. The oppressive hum vanished, replaced by ringing in my ears. I raced through the house, flinging open the front door. Outside, the driveway looked normal. The pine stood still under a midday sun, as if waiting. The car started on the first try now, and I tore out of there, gravel flying. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw the house twist and shimmer like a mirage dissolving under a scorching sun. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened or how many realities overlapped in that house. My mind still replays the overlapping silhouettes, the shifting landscapes, and the man who was me yet wasn't. Sometimes I dream about the door in the hallway and wake up drenched in cold sweat, heart pounding like it's about to burst. Other times I find an item in my apartment that I'm sure I left behind in that impossible place. Each time my throat goes dry and my hands begin to shake uncontrollably. Even now I struggle to believe my own memories. Perhaps it was a psychological breakdown caused by stress. Or maybe the house truly sits at a crossroads of realities. All I know is that I can still feel its pull, that subtle vibration in the back of my mind whenever I close my eyes. When the wind blows late at night and I catch a faint reflection in the glass. Half expect to see that other me watching, unsure which side of the mirror he belongs to. I've tried telling myself I escaped, that I'm free. But some nights I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. Soft, measured footsteps that pause as though someone is standing right outside the door listening. I tighten my fists beneath the covers, my breath catching in my throat, and wonder if maybe the house hasn't completely let me go. The sense of being both witness and intruder lingers on the edges of my thoughts, a low hum threatening to pull me back into that shifting nightmare. And that is a terror I can never outrun. Tray 10. The first thing I remember is how the silence felt like a living entity in that desolate place. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of something else. Something that seemed to linger in the walls. In the peeling paint and in the stale air that rushed into my lungs with each shaky breath, I had gone to the tour of the old asylum. Out of curiosity, expecting some dusty history lessons and a few tales of madness, I never imagined the building itself would imprint its history on me, making me carry fragments of other people's lives, their fears, their obsessions. But I felt it the moment I stepped through the massive iron gates, a subtle but persistent pull, an indescribable tension that clung to my skin and never let go. I recall how my heart pounded in my chest when the guide mentioned in hushed tones that the asylum had housed the most severe cases, individuals with fractured minds stuck in labyrinths of their own making. There was an implication that these walls had absorbed the energy of countless tortured souls. I only half listened at first, more preoccupied with the unsteady flicker of the single overhead bulb in the lobby. Every time it buzzed, I felt a jolt in my nerves as if something electrical was crawling just beneath my flesh. Even from that first moment, I suspected there was more to this place than old medical instruments and crumbling staircases. The tour started in a large hallway lined with windows that were mostly boarded up. A cold draft seeped in through the cracks, making me shiver. Even though it wasn't particularly chilly outside, my breath came in short bursts, and I tried to keep calm by focusing on the squeak of my shoes against the worn tiles. The floor was covered in scuff marks and mysterious stains I didn't want to examine too closely. I felt a wave of nausea, an odd sense that the floor beneath my feet wasn't stable. Not in the literal sense, but almost as if I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. Moving deeper inside, we passed a series of heavy doors with tiny barred windows set into them. I didn't want to look through those windows yet. I couldn't stop myself. Each one showed a cramped, barren room. In some, I imagined shadows scuttling across the walls, even though I saw nothing with my own eyes. The guide explained in a low voice that these were isolation cells. He spoke of how patients once screamed and scratched at those same doors. He spoke as if the building itself had ears absorbing every outburst of despair and terror. The longer I walked, the more I felt it, a suffocating heaviness pressed against my chest. By the time we reached what used to be a recreation room, I was perspiring. My shirt clung uncomfortably to my back, and I realized my heartbeat had become a drumbeat inside my ears. The place was large with white tiles on the walls, now stained with brownish streaks from years of neglect. Several old chairs were scattered around, most of them broken or missing legs. There was a stale odor of dampness and rotting fabric. Strangely, I also caught a faint whiff of something antiseptic, almost like a memory of the disinfectants once used to keep the wards clinically clean. It felt as though the past was still lingering, refusing to yield to time. At this point, the guide remarked in a quiet murmur that visitors sometimes claimed the building was alive, that it devoured the memories of all who lived there. I recall how my breath caught in my throat when he referred to it as a collective consciousness. The more he spoke, the more a small nagging voice in my head insisted this was no mere folklore. Standing there, I had the uncanny sense that invisible eyes watched us from the corners from behind the broken furniture. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and I found myself swallowing repeatedly, my mouth dry as cotton. When we finally left the asylum, I felt a curious mix of relief and apprehension. Relief to see sunlight again, to smell fresh air in place of that decaying stench. Apprehension because a faint tugging sensation lingered inside me as if I'd left a piece of myself behind. The guide concluded with a brief warning. Some people claim to experience vivid dreams, flashbacks that didn't belong to them. It was said that those with open minds, those easily susceptible, might even manifest strange abilities or develop phobias they never had before. I remember forcing a smile, thinking it was an eerie but entertaining story. That night I had the first dream. I saw a cluttered room filled with dusty medical charts and battered filing cabinets. I sensed unrelenting fear coursing through my veins, and though it felt real, I knew it wasn't my fear. My hands shook in the dream, gripping the edges of a rusted bed frame. I heard distant footsteps echoing down hallways that twisted and contorted like reflections in a funhouse mirror. Waking up, I realized my heart was racing. my body slick with sweat. It took me several minutes of gulping air before I was sure I was truly safe in my own apartment. Over the next few days, things escalated. At my job, I caught myself humming old tunes I'd never heard before, discordant lullabies that unsettled my coworkers. When asked about it, I could only mumble that it must be a song stuck in my head from childhood, though deep down I knew that wasn't true. Each night brought new nightmares, each more vivid than the last. I saw doctors speaking in hushed tones, their mouths moving soundlessly. I watched my own hand scribble notes in an archaic style of handwriting that looked nothing like mine. Sometimes I felt my stomach twist in fear at the hint of a figure standing at the end of a hallway, always just out of focus. Increasingly, I experienced sudden surges of adrenaline as if I was preparing to defend myself from an unseen threat. My breathing would become ragged, my palms cold and clammy. At one point, I recall gripping the edge of my kitchen counter so hard that my fingernails left scratches on the surface. I couldn't explain the terror I felt. There was no reason for it, at least, not in the logical sense. Yet it kept returning in waves, accompanied by fleeting images of tiled floors, barred windows, and flickering lights. I tried to brush off these sensations, telling myself it was just an overactive imagination fueled by that unsettling tour. But on the third night after my visit, I woke up screaming from a nightmare in which I was strapped to a wooden chair. In the dream, a band of unnatural light buzzed above me, and I heard the hum of electronic devices I couldn't see. I felt cold metal pressed against my temple. The moment I opened my eyes, tears streaked down my cheeks, and I noticed my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I blinked several times to dispel the image, but the tactile memory of leather restraints against my wrists seemed too real to ignore. Over time, I began to realize that these experiences weren't just staying within my mind. Inexplicably, I seemed to know how to do certain things I had never learned. One evening, I discovered I could navigate complicated crossword puzzles with bizarre ease, filling in clues related to archaic medical terms and early 20th century treatments. It felt as though I was tapping into another person's expertise. This newfound knowledge terrified me. My mind was becoming a patchwork of experiences I didn't own. There were phobias, too irrational fears that slammed into me without warning. I began avoiding bathrooms because the sound of dripping water paralyzed me with an inexplicable dread. I found myself checking corners of rooms obsessively convinced I might find a figure lurking there. My paranoia grew so intense that I sometimes refused to turn off the lights in my apartment at night. Yet even in brightness, I sensed shadowy silhouettes gliding in my peripheral vision. Each time I spun around to catch them, I found nothing. As the days turned into weeks, my energy drained. I was exhausted from constant nightmares and the relentless feeling that I was on the brink of something horrible. My appetite vanished. The mere thought of food made me queasy, as though I was recalling another person's memory of distaste or forced feeding. I tried confiding in a close friend about my experiences, but I only managed to speak in vague terms that the asylum had gotten under my skin, that I couldn't shake off the sense of being haunted. He seemed concerned but unsure how to help, telling me I might want to consult a professional. In a half-hearted attempt at encouragement, he mentioned that stress sometimes manifests in strange ways. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just stress. There was no rational explanation for how I'd learned the precise layout of the asylum's interior or recognized the names of people I'd never met. Occasionally, I found myself scribbling in a notebook, not knowing what I intended to write, until I looked down and saw the frantic scroll of an unfamiliar hand. The words made little sense. Disjointed phrases about electroshock therapy, confessions of unresolved guilt, fragmented pleas for release. Each time I caught myself, I tore out the pages and stuffed them in the trash, but they never stayed there long. Something compelled me to retrieve them, as if discarding those words might unravel a vital thread connecting me to my own sanity. Hallucinations became more frequent. There were moments when I stepped into my living room and found it transformed into a hospital. Corridor. The furniture seemed to melt away, replaced by steel trolleys and flickering fluorescent lights. I heard distant moans echoing off tile walls. My pulse hammered in my ears and my vision blurred until I forced myself to blink rapidly. With each blink, reality returned. But the boundary between what was real and what was an echo of the asylum grew thinner by the day. I tried visiting a therapist, explaining in carefully chosen words that I was troubled by intrusive thoughts and disturbing dreams. I avoided mentioning the old asylum, directly fearful of sounding delusional. The therapist suggested relaxation techniques, breathing exercises, journaling. I tried them all, but none quelled the nightmares or the sudden onslaught of terror. During one session, I became so unnerved by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead that my chest tightened in panic. It took all my willpower not to bolt from the office. Eventually, I sought out more information about the asylum. Late at night, bathed in the computer's glow, I combed through local archives for patient records, staff documents, any scrap of data that might explain my predicament. Although many files were sealed or lost to time, I found references to a peculiar phenomenon among staff who had worked there for extended periods. Some claimed that the building itself influenced their dreams, that it fed on emotional energy. I discovered testimonies from orderlies who quit their jobs because they felt a shift in their personalities, unexplained phobias, sudden talents, or jarring bursts of memory that weren't their own. One line from an old newspaper article echoed in my mind long after I read it. The asylum breathes as its occupants breathe. The asylum remembers what its occupants forget. A chilling wave coursed through my body, leaving me breathless. I realized with dread that I had become part of the cycle. I'd allowed that place to sink its hooks into my psyche, and now it was feeding me fragments of its collective consciousness. Every dream, every new phobia, every piece of foreign knowledge was a sliver of a patient's life or a staff member's burden. It was as if the asylum was continuing its function. Even in abandonment, distributing the weight of countless minds to any visitors sensitive enough to receive it. My anxiety reached a peak one night when I awoke to find myself standing in my dark bedroom, heart pounding like a jackhammer. I was halfway to the door, poised as if I were about to flee from someone or something. My chest tightened and cold sweat trickled down my spine. In that moment, I felt sure I wasn't alone. I sensed another presence in the room. Perhaps multiple presences like invisible silhouettes crowding around me, each one carrying its own anguish, terror, and desperation. My throat went dry and I stood paralyzed, listening to my own ragged breathing in the darkness. That was my breaking point. I resolved to go back to the asylum. Some instinct told me that the only way to rid myself of these foreign memories was to confront them at their source. The idea of stepping inside that decaying building again made my stomach churn, yet I felt no alternative. So on a cold gray afternoon, I drove back to those iron gates. My entire body trembled with trepidation as I pried open the door, stepping into the gloom. The air felt charged, as if it recognized me. My breathing grew shallow, my heart pounding so loudly that my ears seemed to vibrate. I wandered through the labyrinthine corridors, stepping over broken tiles and shattered glass. The deeper I went, the more my perception warped. At times it looked as though the walls pulsed gently, as if they were inhaling and exhaling. The hair on my arms stood on end. Though I saw no actual figures, I felt them everywhere I passed. Empty rooms that somehow seemed occupied. I sensed the stories of those who had been confined in that place, their hopes and despairs swirling in the stagnant air. My limbs felt heavy, as if I carried the weight of all those memories. Eventually, I found a small room that looked like an old storage closet. Inside, I discovered a rusted metal cabinet. I felt compelled to open it, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the handle. Within it lay files presumably left behind, patient charts, notes on experimental therapies, scribbled diaries. Though the text was faded and water-damaged, I recognized the words from my own nightmares, phrases I had written down in my frantic scrawls. It was as if I was staring at a distorted mirror reflecting countless souls. With trembling hands, I placed the files on an old table. My intention was vague at best. Maybe to read through them, maybe to burn them, or simply to acknowledge their existence, I felt an almost electric charge coursing from the documents into my fingertips. My vision blurred momentarily as if I stood at the center of a vast mental storm. Then came a quiet revelation, more of an instinct than a thought. The asylum didn't want to destroy me. It wanted me to bear witness. In some twisted way, it needed to share its memories so they wouldn't die within these walls. I left the papers where I found them, a curious calm washing over me. My hands still shook and a wave of cold sweat clung to my brow, but the crushing pressure in my chest lifted slightly. It felt like the building understood that I knew its secret, and that acknowledgement was enough. Step by step, I retraced my path to the entrance, each breath growing steadier. Outside, the daylight seemed brighter, the air fresher. My heart still pounded, but it did so with less panic and more determination. In the days that followed, the nightmares receded to a dull murmur. Occasionally, I still dream of corridors and shadowy figures, but I find I can stand my ground in those dreams. The phobias and sudden insights haven't vanished entirely yet. I feel a semblance of control. It's as if the asylum's presence is still within me, but no longer battling for dominance. I sense that I'm a keeper of its secrets, now entrusted with fragments of its history that refuse to remain buried. Sometimes I question my sanity, unsure if my interpretations are real or mere delusions. The anxiety remains a tight coil in my gut that never fully loosens, especially when I catch sight of a flickering light or hear the distant echo of footsteps in an empty hallway. But I survived. I walked away. And though I haven't found complete peace, I've earned a weary acceptance of the horrors I carry. Even now, writing this, my chest tightens with the memory of that first step inside the asylum. Yet an odd calm washes over me, too, a sense that I've glimpsed a hidden truth. Some places hold memories like a vault, and if you're receptive, those memories might seep into you forever, altering your sense of self. I still catch myself humming those eerie lullabies and scribbling down strange notes from time to time. The tension never truly leaves. The idea of being watched lingers in the corners of my mind, but I can live with it, unsettling as it is. Sometimes late at night, when my apartment is bathed in the hum of a single lamp, I feel the asylum's collective consciousness stirring in me. I feel the building's heartbeat align with mine. It's a ghostly reminder that not all hauntings come from spirits or apparitions. Some are woven from the shared anguish of countless souls. And once you've touched that tapestry, it's impossible to unravel yourself completely. I'm left with the certainty that my life and my reality have been permanently threaded with whispers from a place that never lets go of what it devours. Yet I remain changed. Watchful, a living testament to the asylum's undying presence. It may not kill, but it can alter a person's essence, leaving them to wander the margins of sanity with a shadow of dread always at their back. And that, I think, is the most chilling fate of all. Story 11. From the moment I first climbed the narrow staircase to that attic, I felt something was off. A cold air current brushed over me, even though it was the middle of summer, and the stagnant darkness clung to every corner as if refusing to let go. My pulse throbbed in my ears, a rapid percussion that made it impossible to ignore my sudden unease. The place seemed to breathe along with me, releasing soft creaks and subtle pops that hinted at a hidden life within the rafters. My mouth went dry, and I remember wiping clammy sweat from my forehead before stepping in. The smell of musty paper and old dust enveloped me like a warning. In that moment, I was sure I'd stepped into something beyond normal comprehension. An atmosphere so dense with foreboding that it felt like stepping inside a dream where reality is only half remembered. I'm a writer by trade, always chasing solitude and inspiration in every nook and cranny I can find. That converted attic above an aging brick building promised both a quiet retreat with enough space to line the walls with books and let my creativity flow. The landlord mentioned there had been some talk about the space's strange aura, but he brushed it off as an old wives' tale. I nodded, feigning confidence, assuring him I had no concerns. He seemed relieved, quickly handing me the key and suggesting I keep the windows open if the atmosphere felt too stuffy. I thanked him, but once I stood alone in that cramped entryway, I began questioning whether I had overestimated my own courage. There was a presence in the air that I couldn't name, an almost electric charge that set every hair on my arms upright. The attic itself was somewhat cozy in design. Low beams crisscrossing overhead, a single window that allowed a beam of light to illuminate the dusty planks, and a surprising amount of floor space for a converted loft. I set up my table near the window, eager to harness that faint patch of brightness for my writing sessions. Yet even in daylight, shadows hung ominously, especially in the corners where the ceiling sloped too low for me to stand upright. The first few nights were relatively calm, though I did notice a lingering sense of being watched. It was a subtle intrusion, a prickling of the skin. Whenever I tried to concentrate on my work, my heartbeat would accelerate suddenly, and I'd find myself stopping mid-sentence to scan the room, convinced there was movement out of the corner of my eye. Of course, I'd see nothing but the same inert shapes of boxes and shelves. I remember one evening when I was working on a particularly dark story. The plot involved a bleak character who thrived in isolation and possessed a deep-seated rage. I had begun typing his backstory, fleshing out his obsessions and fears. Each keystroke felt like a plunge into some hidden recess of my own psyche. As the night grew deeper, the only sound was the frantic tapping of my fingers on the keyboard. Then a quiet rustling broke the silence. My breath caught and I froze in place. It was so soft that I wasn't sure I had heard anything at all. Slowly, I lifted my gaze from the screen. In the far corner, the shadow seemed darker than usual, shaped into something that looked vaguely human in outline. A cold jolt of fear seized my chest, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. But in the next blink, the outline was gone. I spent the rest of that night scanning every shadowy corner, my heart thrumming like a trapped animal's. My neck tensed and beads of sweat cooled unpleasantly on my skin. I kept telling myself that it was just my imagination, a trick of the weak lamplight coupled with a mind consumed by a dark story. Yet part of me sensed something else. I dismissed it, blaming fatigue and the claustrophobic environment. But once I started noticing that my mind's ideas appeared to resonate physically in the attic, the fear became impossible to rationalize away. My footsteps would echo with an almost rhythmic pattern, as if the floorboards were responding to my internal monologue. Occasionally, I'd hear muted scraping behind the walls, as though some presence was shifting in tune with my thoughts. My writing routine continued for several days, each day leaving me more on edge. The tension in my body made my hands tremble whenever I typed. My jaw began to ache from constant clenching. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision with increasing regularity. At times, they simply darted along the walls. Other times, they seemed to linger just long enough for me to perceive an outline, an arm, a torso, a face half veiled in darkness. I was too terrified to speak even to myself. My throat felt tight and dry, and my voice would have cracked had I tried to utter anything. One afternoon, I decided to take a break from my regular work and sift through some old manuscripts. Sorting through them felt like wrestling with ghosts of stories that never saw completion. Among them was a tale about an ominous figure who existed in perpetual twilight. Reading through the pages made my skin crawl because I realized how intimately that character's presence matched the shape I'd glimpsed in the attic's corner. Cold sweat trickled down my spine, and I closed the file, determined not to dwell on the thought for too long. But I couldn't shake the unnerving sense that my fictional creation was coming alive. Soon the attic began showing more overt signs of its unnatural influence. Whenever I tried to write something peaceful or mundane, the words felt forced, as though the environment itself was rejecting them. The air around me seemed to thicken whenever I wrote tense or frightening scenes, as if the place craved that energy. My heart pounded so hard that it almost hurt, and a sick sense of dread clung to my stomach. At night, I would jolt awake to the sound of faint whispers echoing from the wooden beams above, though I never quite caught their content. The lines between dream and wakefulness started to blur, and my paranoia grew. I found myself checking behind furniture under my desk, even inside the old trunk in the corner, in a frantic attempt to locate the source of that intangible presence. It wasn't long before the shadows I had seen at the periphery of my vision became more substantial. One night, while hunched over my desk working on a particularly grisly excerpt, I caught a reflection in my computer screen, an ink-black silhouette standing behind me, looming with impossible stillness. My heart hammered so violently I thought I might faint. By the time I had spun around panting, the figure was gone. In the reflection, I noticed I was ashen, lips parted in a silent gasp. My entire body felt as though I'd been plunged into ice water, numb and shaking. At the same time, I tried to explain these occurrences to an acquaintance over the phone using vague language so as not to come across as completely deranged. He suggested I was overstressed, maybe working too many hours in a confined space. He recommended fresh air and a more social routine. In the back of my mind, I clung to that rational explanation. Yet deep down, I suspected there was more to it, something far beyond mere fatigue. A few nights later, I distinctly felt a hand brush against my shoulder. My immediate reaction was to leap up, knocking my chair sideways. All I saw was the swirling gloom in the corners of the attic. My breathing came in ragged bursts, and sweat dampened the collar of my shirt. Every muscle in my neck contracted until my shoulders ached. I told myself it was just a muscle spasm or a jolt caused by my nerves, but a voice in my head screamed otherwise. From that point forward, I found it nearly impossible to write without feeling watched or worse accompanied. The manuscript I was developing took a dark turn. My protagonist was a tormented soul locked in an endless battle with his own sanity. Each line I typed seemed to manifest somewhere in the attic: a footstep, a hushed breath, a fleeting half-formed shape. It became clear the attic was acting like some sort of psychic amplifier, pulling the phantoms of my mind into reality. Soon entire paragraphs of my writing seemed to echo around me as though my words had left the page and taken on a life of their own. At one point, I wrote a scene about a robed figure wandering through an abandoned house, leaving cryptic symbols on the walls. Moments after saving that chapter, I glanced at the far side of the attic and felt my lungs constrict in sheer terror. There in the dim light, I saw faint scrawls on the wooden paneling markings that resembled twisted letters, dripping as though freshly inked. My pulse hammered at my temples and my vision blurred. Momentarily, I staggered over to examine them more closely, my hands cold and trembling. The words were barely legible, but I recognized the pattern from my story. It was as if the attic itself was spitting my creations back at me, etched into the walls. Worse yet, the characters from past manuscripts began to appear. They started as flickering silhouettes drifting across my peripheral vision. Gradually, they formed into translucent apparitions with distinct faces. Faces I had described in my work. I would catch sight of them in the reflection of the window or lurking just behind a half-open door. They seemed aware of me, their eyes following my every movement with a hungry curiosity. My breath would falter and I'd break into cold sweats, heartbeat thudding in my ears. It felt like they were waiting for me to acknowledge them. At times, I heard them whisper my name. Their voices were echoes of descriptions I had typed into existence, raspy or low-airy or hissed. I found the courage to approach one after it stood at the threshold of my bedroom area, silent and still. As I drew nearer, my body vibrated with tension. My heart pounded until I feared it might burst. The figure, a specter from my earlier novel, had eyes black as night. I asked in a trembling voice why it had come. It only tilted its head and a faint whisper of breath exhaled as though it couldn't find the words. Then it dissipated into the gloom. The attic itself seemed to relish my fear. No matter how many lamps I set up, a perpetual dimness persisted, enveloping the corners and edges in a swirling haze. The rafters groaned at odd intervals, mimicking speech patterns without forming actual words. My sanity felt like a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point. If I was honest with myself, I sensed that I was no longer just a tenant in that attic. I was a subject of some larger design. My journaling turned obsessive. filled with frantic scribbles about shapes, voices, and walls that breathed. I found it difficult to determine whether I was awake or dreaming. Paranoia coursed through my veins. Every time I left the attic, I felt a strong compulsion to return, as though it had embedded a hook in my consciousness. The more I wrote, the more these manifestations gained form. They moved with intent. No longer the passive outlines they once were. On a particularly grim evening, I gazed into the bathroom mirror and saw a faint shadow hovering behind me. A character from one of my older stories, a malicious figure with an unnerving grin. My stomach flipped and I nearly retched from the overload of panic. The reflection didn't vanish immediately this time. Instead, it maintained a steady, penetrating stare before dissolving, leaving me gasping for air. My hand shook uncontrollably and I could taste the acid tang of bile in my mouth. Eventually, the realization struck with horrifying clarity. I was never meant to be in control of this narrative. Everything that was happening to me followed the logic of a storyline. But if I was the writer, how could I be the one caught in someone else's plot? The idea gnawed at my mind relentlessly. I began to suspect that I too was merely a character conjured and placed here by a higher imagination. My every thought seemed to accelerate the process, as if the attic was feeding on this revelation to push the boundaries further. The manifestations grew bolder, stepping out from shadows to brush against me. Whisper suggestions that I was only a fragment in a grander tapestry of someone else's creation. One stormy night, I sat at my desk, thunder echoing through the ceiling, trying to cling to any last shred of reason. The lamp on my desk flickered, casting warped silhouettes on the wall. My heart raced and my vision blurred at the edges, but I kept writing, trying to compose a different ending, one where I would somehow reclaim my reality. The walls felt like they were closing in, the attic's psychic pressure crushing me under the weight of my own illusions. My breath came in short gasps, my entire body was soaked in a cold sweat, and my eyes stung from strain. Then an overpowering certainty washed over me. I could break free if I simply walked away from the attic, never looking back. If I could muster the will to deny this place its influence, maybe I could dissolve its hold. Summoning every ounce of courage, I bolted from my chair, ignoring the sensation of hands grabbing at my shirt and the whispers chanting half-formed words behind me. My heart battered against my ribs and my lungs burned. I nearly fell scrambling down the stairs, but I managed to fling the door open and stumble outside into the night air. The cool rain on my skin felt like a shock that jolted me back to some semblance of humanity. I wish I could say that I found perfect peace afterward, but a persistent awareness remains. I can't deny the feeling that I was perhaps still a character within a much larger narrative. The attic seemed to confirm that suspicion, conjuring my creations as living, breathing entities. Though I escaped that confined, oppressive space, I can't fully escape the sense that I haven't reached the final chapter. Even on calm days when the sun streams through my new apartment's windows, there's a faint echo in the back of my mind, like a page waiting to be turned. And sometimes late at night, I sense a shadow flicker at the edge of my periphery, just a subtle twitch in my vision. The chill it brings is unmistakable. And for a brief, heart-topping second, my body replays the terror of the attic. In that moment, I remember that I am not simply the author of my own story. I am also the character of a bigger tale, one that might call me back into darkness at any moment. And that lingering thought, more than anything, leaves me with a perpetual sense of unease, as though reality could slip through my fingers at any time, and I would be swallowed once more by a story that was never truly mine. Story 12. The first time I sensed something was wrong, the house felt impossibly cold. It wasn't an ordinary chill from a drafty corridor or an open window I'd forgotten to latch. It was a dense, penetrating cold that clung to my skin and made my breath catch in my throat. My pulse thudded in my ears as I stood in the foyer, staring at the darkness that pulled in every corner. I swear it breathed in tandem with me, exhaling stale air whenever I exhaled, inhaling sharply every time I did. The old planks beneath my feet groaned as if the foundation of the house was sighing with some kind of subdued hunger. Right then, my chest tightened and a sudden wave of nausea rose in my stomach. My limbs felt shaky. My heart hammered, and in my head, a quiet voice insisted I was no longer alone in that place, no matter how empty it seemed. I live in this house on the outskirts of a small town, far enough from any busy roads that silence usually comes easily. My only companions are my pets, a dog named Jasper and a cat named Maya. Normally, I relish the quiet, but over the past weeks, that stillness started to feel unnatural, as though it concealed a hidden presence waiting to reveal itself. At first, I brushed off the notion as stress. Still, a distinct sense of being watched trailed me from room to room, day and night. My skin would tingle and I would swear. I heard a faint scraping noise behind the walls. Sometimes in the dead of night, I thought I heard my own voice echo from somewhere down the hall. Murmuring words I couldn't quite make out, I tried to shake it off as a figment of my imagination. Yet the feeling only grew stronger. I began noticing that my pets weren't acting like themselves. Jasper, who normally greeted me with enthusiastic barks and tail wags, had become strangely silent, eyeing the corners of the living room with alert suspicion. He would stand by the basement door, hackles raised as if something was lurking just out of sight. Maya, usually aloof and poised, started avoiding certain rooms entirely. She refused to enter the study, hissing at the threshold, then sprinting away like she'd seen a predator. My palms would sweat whenever I followed her gaze into the gloom. Heart thumping as I tried to spot the slightest movement, I'd remind myself that old houses creak and shift. Still, each time I heard an unexpected thud or discovered fresh scratches on the windowsills, my breath would catch in my chest and my fear ratcheted up a notch. Then came the vocal imitations. Late one afternoon, I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes when I heard Jasper's muffled bark from upstairs. I dried my hands, called his name, but he didn't trot down as usual. Instead, I heard what sounded like my own voice, quietly mimicking the words I had just spoken. "Jasper, come here," but in a slightly garbled tone, as though repeated through an old tape recorder. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I hollered for him again, more firmly. This time, no response came from the floor above. Instead, I heard his nails clicking in the hallway behind me, and I almost jumped out of my skin. When I turned, Jasper was standing there, head cocked, staring at me. His jaws parted slightly, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes, like he too had heard me calling from two places at once. My chest pounded so hard I thought my ribs might crack. I felt faint, so I gripped the countertop to stay steady while the overhead light hummed with an unsettling vibration that seemed to match the pitch of my buzzing nerves. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses sometimes carry sound in strange ways. Maybe my voice had echoed, or maybe the pipes carried it upstairs somehow. But that didn't explain the uncanny replication of my exact tone. I told myself to stop being dramatic. Still, the tension weighed on me heavily. My mouth was perpetually dry and my hands trembled, even performing ordinary tasks like flipping a light switch. By the end of the day, my nerves were shot. The next morning, I thought fresh air might help me clear my head. I grabbed Jasper's leash and whistled for him. As we approached the front door, I heard an odd thumping behind me. I turned in time to see Maya sprint across the living room and out of sight. My heart gave a nervous flutter, but I forced myself to stay calm. While walking down the front steps, I could almost feel the house behind me watching me depart. An absurd notion that nevertheless made me shiver in the warm morning sun. Jasper pressed close to my leg, ears flattened, and refused to move more than a few yards from the porch. Eventually, I gave up the walk and returned inside. As the days wore on, the imitations became more convincing. Once I was rummaging in the pantry for some tea when I heard my own laughter echo from upstairs. My blood froze. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to decipher if I'd actually made any sound or if it was something else. Then I saw a fleeting shadow at the top of the stairs. It looked human in height and shape, but it moved stiffly like a puppet on strings. I called out, half certain I wouldn't be answered. Instead, an eerie hush pressed in around me. My chest tightened as I forced myself to climb the steps. I felt each creak in the wood reverberate up my spine. Once I reached the landing, I found nothing but a stagnant gloom that tugged at the corners of my vision. I fled back to the kitchen on shaking legs, cursing under my breath. My nerves strained to the breaking point one night when I sat on the couch trying to distract myself with some TV. Suddenly, Maya appeared in the hallway and started meowing, but her voice sounded off as if it were layered with something else, some deeper resonance that wasn't feline. For an instant, her mouth stayed open longer than her typical meow. It was as though another voice, almost human but contorted, was emerging from her throat. My chest burned as panic set in. Cold sweat trickled down my temples. She turned and skewered away, leaving me trembling. I felt a sharp sense of foreboding, as though something inside the house was practicing. It was learning to mimic, and it was getting better. The worst encounter happened shortly afterward. I was in bed, drifting in that hazy state between sleep and waking, when I heard a voice from the hallway outside my room. It sounded eerily like me, but slower, like a record played at half speed, calling my own name. My heart pounded so violently it drowned out every other sensation. Adrenaline surged. My breath came in shallow bursts, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. I wanted to leap up, throw open the door, and shine a flashlight into the hall. But terror pinned me to the mattress. I convinced myself it was some dream-induced hallucination, yet deep down I knew it wasn't. Eventually, I mustered the courage to investigate. Gripping a flashlight, I crept out of my bedroom, stepping as softly as possible. The air smelled stale and slightly metallic, almost like old blood. A thought I shut down the moment it surfaced, reminding myself that I had no evidence of anything violent happening here. My hands were slick with sweat and my teeth chattered, though the temperature wasn't particularly low. Each footstep felt like a hammer blow on the wooden floor. I glanced at the walls, half expecting them to ripple like something alive. In that moment, I couldn't dismiss the idea that the entire house was some slumbering organism waiting to entrap me if I made the wrong move. Then early one morning, I woke to an uncanny silence. No bird calls, no wind rustling through the trees outside, nothing. The hush inside the house pressed on my eardrums like a weight. I made my way to the kitchen to start coffee, determined to cling to some shred of normalcy. That's when I saw myself already standing there. It looked exactly like me from behind. The same posture, the same slope to the shoulders, the same hair color, every detail mirrored. My pulse thundered in my ears as I watched the figure slowly turn around. Its face was my face, the same stubble, even the same faint scar near my eyebrow. My stomach lurched violently and I nearly lost my balance. For a moment I couldn't move. My arms and legs felt boneless and an icy wave of terror washed through me. Even breathing felt impossible. My mind reeled with disbelief, trying to wake me from what had to be a nightmare. But as I stood there, I felt the sticky sensation of sweat on my palms, heard the racing thud of my heart, and sensed that no dream had ever been so vividly, horrifyingly real. I managed to croak out a single word that scratched at my throat. Who the figure? My doppelganger tilted its head, its lips parted, and it spoke in my voice quietly, stating that it was no simple intruder, but rather the house itself. The words it used, brief, deliberate, unmistakable, said that the structure had become self-aware over time. It claimed it was now capable of manifesting physical duplicates of every living thing that had ever set foot on its floors. My mind felt like it was about to fracture. I tried to process the notion of a sentient property. My heart hammered wildly in my chest, and for a moment I was sure I might faint. The explanation continued, though mostly in a calm, conversational tone that belied the horror of the situation. It told me that the house existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. There were infinite versions of me, of Jasper, of Maya, and of anyone else who had ever dwelled here, all overlapping in this place. The longer I listened, the more my perception wavered. My vision blurred at the edges, and the walls seemed to shimmer as though they were flickering between realities. My breathing hitched, and I had to steady myself against the kitchen counter to keep from collapsing. I remember trying to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. I asked in indirect terms how it had learned to replicate us. The house through my double responded, describing how every dimension's occupant left behind some imprint, a resonance. Over time, the structure collected these echoes and shaped them into physical forms. I could almost feel the house's presence in every beam, every nail, every dusty corner. The taste of copper filled my mouth. I might have bitten my tongue in my anxiety. My skin tingled with dread as I realized the half-formed silhouettes and eerie voices I had witnessed weren't hallucinations. They had been incomplete copies, each iteration refining itself until it achieved perfect mimicry. I was overwhelmed by a suffocating sense of claustrophobia. My eyes darted around the kitchen. The floor seemed to sink into the earth. The ceiling crept downward and the windows felt miles away. The figure in front of me, the figure that was me, stood unnervingly still as if waiting for me to accept this truth. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest, and my hands shook so hard my vision jolted with every tremor. Adrenaline roared through my veins, but I fought the urge to run. Some instinct told me that fleeing blindly through the house might lead to encountering other less refined duplicates. The mere idea of seeing more twisted reflections of myself or hearing more versions of my own voice made my stomach churn. I forced myself to take one deep breath then another. I noticed that as I did, the figure performed the same inhalation, mirroring my every gesture. It was a horrifying dance with my own image. My mind teetered between panic and a strange fascination. I tried to ask what the house wanted from me, but the words snagged in my throat. In that moment, a wave of vertigo nearly toppled me, and I clutched the edge of the kitchen island. My lips felt cracked, my tongue thick and heavy, as if speech itself required more effort than I could muster. It occurred to me that if the house truly spanned multiple dimensions, then maybe there was a way out that didn't involve simply walking through the front door. Perhaps the ordinary exit was no longer just an exit. Maybe it was a gateway to countless other realities. The thought made my pulse race dangerously. My breath turned shallow again, and I struggled to remain calm enough to think I noticed that every time my panic surged, the house's atmosphere seemed to vibrate with a low hum as though feeding on my fear. The shadows in the corners deepened, stirring as if alive. With a tremor in my limbs, I backed slowly out of the kitchen. The doppelganger took no step forward, only watched me retreat. Its eyes, identical to mine, gleamed with a flat curiosity. I felt an electric jolt of panic tear through me, but I managed to keep my legs steady. One step at a time, I moved down the hallway. I found Jasper cowering by the staircase, ears pinned back. Trembling, Maya lurked under a side table, pupils wide as saucers, letting out low keening sounds that made my hair stand on end. I motioned for them to follow, not daring to speak. My plan, such as it was, involved leaving the house. Even if the property stretched across dimensions, I hoped that physically stepping outside might free me from its grasp. I had no illusions that the ordeal would end just by crossing the threshold. But I craved the open sky, the taste of fresh air. My heart galloped as I reached the front door. I half expected it to be locked or worse, gone. But it was there, and it opened when I turned the knob. I stepped out onto the porch chest. Tight eyes burning with tears. I'd been holding back. Jasper and Maya followed close behind, both so silent I could only tell they were there from the soft scrape of their paws. Outside, the daylight seemed too bright, almost harsh. My head swam and my limbs felt weak, as if I just emerged from a cage. I glanced back at the house. The windows, dark and expressionless, stared back at me with menacing calm. The shape of my own silhouette flickered in the glass. Or maybe it was the reflection of one of my infinite doubles. I couldn't be sure. My lungs ached as I tried to steady my breathing. It took me a long while just standing there, heart pounding, to grasp that I was no longer pinned in place. In that moment, I realized the house had let me go, but not completely. I could feel its presence rooted in my mind, an indelible terror that would never be fully shaken. Even now, as I wrestle with the memory, every squeak of a floorboard, Every whisper of a breeze conjures that creeping dread. I keep looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the shape of my own face lurking in the shadows, or to hear my own voice echoing back at me from behind a door. And sometimes late at night, I imagine I hear that low humming as if the house is humming through me, reminding me that our connection spans more than a simple set of walls and a roof. I stand by my decision to leave that place and never look back, though I know that leaving isn't truly the end. The house in its impossible existence still reaches across dimensions. It holds every version of me. And I suspect that means I might catch glimpses of it wherever I go. In an unguarded moment, I might see a flicker in a mirror or a shimmer in the corner of my eye, reminding me that I was part of it once and still am in countless other realities. When I close my eyes at night, I envision my doppelganger frozen in the kitchen where I left it wearing my face like a perfect mask. I see infinite silhouettes of people, creatures, and echoes haunting every corridor shaped by the house's restless consciousness. And in that final image, I shudder at the knowledge that some horrors don't require fangs or knives or the violence of death. Sometimes all it takes is a place alive and aware, quietly replicating your existence until you can't be sure which version of you is truly real, and that I've realized is a terror from which you might never fully escape.